Number 17 by Louis Tracy. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Outcome of Artistic Curiosity. Taxi, sir? Yes, sir. Number 4 will be yours. A red-faced, loud-breathing commissionaire, engaged in the lucrative task of pocketing sixpences as quickly as he could summon cabs, vanished in a swirl of macintoshes and umbrellas. People who had arrived at the theatre in fine weather were emerging into a drizzle of rain. All London, as the phrase goes, was flocking to see the latest musical comedy at Daly's. But all London, regarded thus collectively, is far from owning motor cars, or even affording taxicabs, so the majority of the playgoers were hurrying on foot towards tube railways and omnibus routes. Still, a popular light opera could hardly fail to draw many patrons from the upper ranks of society. And, in the crush at the main exit, Francis Berold Thaden, hesitating whether to walk or wait the hazard of a cab, deemed himself fortunate when a panting commissionaire promised to secure a taxi in half a minute. Automobiles of every known variety were snorting up to the curb and bustling off again as promptly as their users could enter and bestow themselves in dim interiors. Being a considerate person, wishful also to light a cigarette, Thaden moved out of the way. In so doing, he was cannoned against by an impetuous footman, whose cry, "Your car, sir," led him to follow the man's alert eyes. He saw a tall, elderly gentleman, with clean-shaven, shrewd, and highly intelligent features, of the type which finance, or the law, or a combination of both, seems to evolve only in big cities, escorting a young lady from the vestibule. Then Thaden remembered that he had noticed this selfsame girl's remarkable beauty as she was silhouetted in white against the dark background of a first-tier box. He had even speculated idly as to her identity, and had come to the conclusion, on catching her face in profile, that she must be the daughter of the man seated by her side but half hidden behind a heavy curtain. The likeness was momentarily lost now while the two neared him, yet discovered anew when they halted for a second at his elbow. Oddly enough, the man was carrying an umbrella, which he proceeded to open, and his daughter's astonished question put their relationship beyond doubt. "Dad," she said, with a charming smile in which there was just a hint of a pout, "aren't you coming home with me?" "No. I must look in at the Constitutional Club. It's only a step. I'll take no harm. This sleet looks worse than it is when every drop shines in the glare of so many lamps. Now, in with you, Evelyn. Tell Downs to come back, and don't forget which club. Anyhow, I'll tell him myself. Shall I wait up for you?" "Well, I shan't be late. I'll be free by the time Downs returns." "Number 4 taxi," came a voice, and Thaden saw his commissionaire perched on the step of a cab swinging in deftly behind the waiting car. The girl, gazing at her father, happened to look for an instant at Thaden, who, fearful lest his candidly admiring glance might have been a trifle too sustained, pretended a hurried interest in an unlighted cigarette. That was all. The three crossed the pavement almost simultaneously. The next moment the unknown goddess was gone, though Thaden snatched a final glimpse of her, faintly visible, yet no less radiantly lovely, as she leaned forward from the depths of the limousine, and waved a white-gloved hand to her father through a window jeweled with raindrops. There was nothing in the incident to provoke a second thought. Assuredly, Frank Thaden, as his friends called him, was not the only man in the vestibule of Daly's theatre who had found the girl well worth looking at, and it was the mere accident of propinquity which enabled him to overhear the quite commonplace remarks of father and daughter. A score of similar occurrences had probably taken place in the like circumstances that night in London, and the maddest dreamer of fantastic dreams would not have heard the fluttering wings of the spirit of romance in connection with any one of them. It was by no means marvelous, therefore, but rather in obedience to the accepted law of things as they are when contrasted with things as they might be, if Thaden both failed to attach any importance to that chance meeting and proceeded forthwith to think of something else. He did not forget it, of course. His artist's eyes had been far too interested in a certain rare quality of delicate femininity in the girl's face and figure, and his ear too quick to appreciate the music of her cultured voice, that he should not be able to recall such pleasant memories later. Indeed, during those fleeting moments on the threshold of the theatre, he had garnered quite a number of minor impressions, not only of the girl, but of her father. In some respects they were singularly alike. Thus, each had the same proud, self-reliant carriage, the same large, brilliant eyes, serene brow and firm mouth, the same repose of manner, the same clear, incisive enunciation. Neither could move in any company, however eclectic, without evoking comment. They held in common that air of refinement and good breeding which is, or should be, the best marked attribute of an aristocracy. It was impossible to imagine either in rags, but, given such a transformation, each would be notable because of the amazing difference that would exist between garb and mien. It must not be imagined that Thaden indulged in this close analysis of the physical characteristics of two complete strangers while his cab was wheeling into the scurry of traffic in Cranbourne Street. Rather did he essay a third time to light the cigarette which he still held between his lips. And yet a third time was his intent balked. A policeman stopped the eastbound stream of vehicles somewhat suddenly at the corner of Charing Cross Road. Owing to the mud, the taxi skidded a few feet beyond the line. A lamp was torn off by a heavy wagon coming south, and a fierce argument between taxi driver and policeman resulted in numbers being demanded for future vengeance. Then Thaden took a hand in the dispute, poured oil on the troubled waters by tipping the policeman half a crown and the driver half a sovereign, these sums being his private estimate of damages to dignity and lamp, and the journey was resumed, with a net loss, to the person who had absolutely nothing to do with the affair, of 12 and 6pence in money and nearly 10 minutes in time. Thaden was not rich, as shall be seen in due course, but he was generous and impulsive. He hated the notion of any one suffering for having done him a service, and the taxi man might reasonably be deemed a real benefactor on that sloppy night. So far as he was concerned, the delay of 10 minutes was of no consequence. It only meant a slightly deferred snuggling down into an easy chair in his flat with a book and a pipe. That is how he would have expressed himself if questioned on the point. In reality, it influenced and controlled his future in the most vital way, because, once the cab had crossed Oxford Street and turned into the quiet thoroughfare on which the first block of Innismore mansions abutted, he passed into a new phase of existence. The cigarette, lighted at last after the altercation, had filled the cab with smoke to such an extent that Thaden lowered a window. At that moment the driver was slowing down to take the corner of the even more secluded road which contained Innismore mansions and the gardens appertaining thereto, and nothing else. Necessarily, Thaden was looking out, and he was very greatly surprised at seeing the unknown gentleman of the theatre walking rapidly round the same corner. He could not be mistaken. The stranger tilted back his umbrella and raised his eyes to ascertain the name of the street, as though he was not quite sure of his whereabouts, and the glare of a lamp fell directly on his clean-cut, almost classical face. Being thus occupied, he did not glance at the passing cab, or recognition might possibly have been mutual, possibly, though not probably, because, during that brief pause on the steps of the theatre, he stood beside Thaden. Hence, he was half-turned toward his daughter while they were discussing the night's immediate program. In itself, the fact that he had gone in the direction of Innismore Mansions rather than toward the Constitutional Club was in no wise remarkable. Nevertheless, he had deceived his daughter, deceived her intentionally, and the knowledge came as a shock to his unsuspected critic in Thaden. He did not look the sort of man who would stoop to petty evasion of the truth. It was as though a statue of Praxiteles, miraculously gifted with life, should express its emotions, not in Attic Greek, but in the up-to-date slang of the Strand. "Well, I'm dashed," said Thaden, or words to that effect, and his cab sped on to the third doorway. Innismore Mansions arranged its roomy flats in blocks of 6, and he occupied number 18. He held a florin in readiness. The rain, now falling heavily, did not encourage any loitering on the pavement. For all that, he saw out of the tail of his eye that the other man was approaching, though he had paused to examine the numbers blazoned on a lamp over the first doorway. "Good night, sir, and thank you," said the taxi driver. The cab made off as Thaden ran up a short flight of steps. Innismore Mansions did not boast elevators. The flats were comfortable, but not absurdly expensive, and their inmates climbed stairs cheerfully. At most, they had only to mount to a second story. Each block owned a uniformed porter, who, on a night like this, even in May, needed rousing from his lair by a bell if in demand. Thaden took the stairs too at a stride, opened the door of number 18, which, with number 17, occupied the top landing. He was valeted and cooked for by an ex-sergeant of the Army Service Corps and his wife, an admirable couple named Bates, and the male of the species appeared before Thaden had removed coat and opera hat in the tiny hall. "Bring my tray in 15 minutes, Bates, and that will be all for tonight," said Thaden. "Yes, sir," said Bates. "Remarkable change in the weather, sir. Rotten. Who would have expected this downpour after such a fine day?" Bates took the coat and hat, and Thaden entered his sitting room, a spacious, square apartment which faced the gardens. He had purposely prevented Bates from coming immediately with his nightly fare, which consisted of a glass of milk and a plate of bread and butter. Truth to tell, the artistic temperament contains a spice of curiosity, which is, in some sense, an exercise of the perceptive faculties. Thaden wanted to raise a window and look out, an unusual action, and one which, therefore, would induce Bates to wonder as to its cause. For once in his life, a man who bothered his head very little about other people's business was puzzled, and meant to ascertain whether or not the unknown was really calling on some resident in Innismore Mansions. It was a harmless bit of espionage. Thaden scarcely knew the names of the other dwellers in his own block, and his acquaintance did not even go that far with any of the remaining tenants of 48 flats, all told. Still, to a writer, the vagaries of the tall stranger were decidedly interesting, so he did open a window, and did thrust his head out, and was just in time to see the owner of the limousine which would call at the Constitutional Club in a quarter of an hour mount the steps leading to numbers 13 to 18. Somehow, the discovery gave Thaden a veritable thrill. Could that pretty girl's father, by any chance, be coming to visit him? A wildly improbable development had been whittled down to a 5-to-1 chance. He closed the window and waited. Yes, actually waited, for the bell to ring. The sitting room door was open, and it faced the hall door. Footsteps sounded sharply on the slate steps of the stairway. When Thaden heard someone climbing to the topmost landing, he was almost convinced that, as usual, the unexpected was about to happen. It did happen, but took its own peculiar path. The unknown rang the bell of number 17, and, after a slight delay, was admitted. Thaden smiled at the anticlimax. A trivial mystery had developed along strictly orthodox lines. A rather good-looking and distinctly well-dressed lady, a Mrs. Lester, occupied number 17. She lived alone, too, he believed. At any rate, he had never seen any other person, except an elderly servant, enter or leave the opposite flat, and he had encountered the tenant herself so seldom that he was not quite certain of recognizing her apart from the environment of the staircase which provided their occasional meeting place. Then he sighed. Romance evidently denied her magic presence to one who wooed her assiduously by his pen. He was yet to learn that the alluring sprite had not only favored him with her attentions during the past 20 minutes, but meant to stick to him like his own shadow for many a day. And he frowned, too. He did not approve of that pretty girl's father visiting the attractive Mrs. Lester in conditions which savored of something underhanded and clandestine. The man had deliberately misled his daughter. He left her with a lie on his lips. Yet never were appearances more deceptive, for the stranger had the outward aspect of one whose word was his bond. "Oh, dash it all, what business is it of mine, anyhow?" growled Thaden, and he laughed sourly as he sat down to write a letter which Bates could take to the post, thus himself practicing a slight deceit intended solely to account for the deferred bringing of the tray. It was apparently an unimportant missive which could well have been postponed till the morning, being merely an announcement to a firm of publishers that he would pay a business call later in the week. In less than 5 minutes it, and another, making an appointment for Wednesday, this being the night of Monday, were written, sealed, directed, and stamped. He rang. Bates came, with laden hands, thinking the tray was in demand. "Kindly post those for me," said Thaden, glancing at the letters. "Better take an umbrella. It's raining cats and dogs." The man had found the door open, and left it so when he entered. Before he could answer, the door of number 17 was opened and closed, with a jingle inseparable from the presence of many small panes of glass in leaden casing, and footsteps sounded on the stairs. For some reason, probably because of the unusual fact that anyone should be leaving Mrs. Lester's flat at so late an hour, both men listened. Then Bates recollected himself. "Yes, sir," he said. Oddly enough, the man's marked pause suggested a question to his employer. "Mrs. Lester's visitor didn't stop long," was the comment. "He came up almost on my heels. I thought it must ha' been a gentleman," said Bates. "Why a gentleman?" laughed Thaden. "I mean, sir, that the step didn't sound like a lady's." "Ah, I see." Vaguely aware that he had committed himself to a definite knowledge as to the sex of Mrs. Lester's visitor, Thaden added, "I didn't actually see anyone on the stairs, but I heard an arrival, and jumped to the same conclusion as you, Bates." Tacitly, master and man shared the same opinion, It was satisfactory to know that Mrs. Lester's male visitors who called at the unconventional hour of 11:30 p.m. were shown out so speedily. Innismore mansions were intensely respectable. No lady could live there alone whose credentials had not satisfied a sharp-eyed secretary. Further, Thaden was aware of a momentary disloyalty of thought toward the distinguished-looking father of that remarkably handsome girl, and it pleased him to find that he had erred. Bates went out, closing the door behind him. He donned an overcoat, secured an umbrella, and presently descended to the street. Yielding again to impulse, Thaden reopened the window and peered down. The stranger was walking away rapidly. A policeman, glistening in cape and overalls, stood at the corner, near a pillar box. The tall man, who topped the burly constable by some inches, halted for a moment to post a letter. Whether by accident or design, he held his umbrella so that the other could not see his face. Then he disappeared. Bates came into view. He dropped Thaden's letters into the box, but he and the policeman exchanged a few words, which, his employer guessed, must surely have dealt with the vagaries of the weather. For an author of repute, Thaden's surmises had been wide of the mark several times that night. The policeman had seen the unknown coming out from the doorway of numbers 13 to 18, and had noted his stature and appearance. "Who's the toff who just left your lot?" he said, when Bates arrived. "Dunno," said Bates. "Someone calling on Mrs. Lester, I fancy." "Why?" "Oh, nothing. Only, if I was tugged up regardless on a night like this, I'd blew a cab fare." "I didn't see him myself," commented Bates. "My boss heard him come, and both of us heard him go. He didn't stay more'n 5 minutes. Wish I was in his shoes. I've got to stick round here till 6 in the morning," grinned the policeman. "Well, cheero, mate, cheero." Bates looked in on his master before retiring for the night. "What time shall I call you, sir?" he said. Thaden was in the pipe and book stage, having exchanged his dress coat for a smoking jacket. He was reading a treatise on aeronautics, and, like every novice, had already formulated a flying scheme which would supersede all known inventions. "Not later than 8, he said. "I must be out by 9. And, by the way, I may as well tell you now. After lunch tomorrow I am going to Brooklands. I return to Waterloo at 6:40. As I have to dine in the West End at 7:30, and my train may be a few minutes behind time, I want you to meet me with a suitcase at the hairdresser's place on the main platform. I'll dress there and go straight to my friend's house. It would be cutting things rather fine if I attempted to come here. I'll have everything ready, sir." Bates was eminently reliable in such matters. He could be depended on to the last stud. The storm which had raged overnight must have cleared the skies for the following day, because Thaden never enjoyed an outing more than his trip to the famous motor track. His business there, however, lay with aviation. A popular magazine had commissioned him to write an article summing up the progress and practical aims of the airmen, and he was devoting afternoon and evening to the quest of information. A couple of experts and a photographer had given him plenty of raw material in the open, but he looked forward with special zest to an undisturbed chat that night with Mr. James Creighton Forbes, millionaire and philanthropist, whose peculiar yet forcible theories as to the peaceful conquest of the air were for the hour engaging the attention of the world's press. He had never met Mr. Forbes. When on the point of writing for an appointment, he had luckily remembered that the great man was a lifelong friend of the professor of physics at his, Thaden's, university, and a delightfully cordial introductory note was forthcoming in the course of a couple of posts. This brought the invitation to dinner. "On Tuesday evening I am dining in Famile," wrote Mr. Forbes, "so, if you are free, join us at 7:30, and we can talk uninterruptedly afterward." The train was not late. Bates, erect and soldierly, was standing at the rendezvous. With him were 2 men whom Thaden had never before seen. One, a bulky, stalwart, florid-faced man of 40, had something of the military aspect. The other supplied his direct antithesis, being small, wizened and sallow. The big man had a round, bullet head, prominent bright blue eyes, and the cheekbones, chin and physical development of a heavyweight pugilist. His companion, whose dark and recessed eyes were noticeably bright, too, could not be more than half his weight, and Thaden would not have been surprised if told that this diminutive person was a dancing master. Naturally, he classed both as acquaintances of his valet, encountered by chance on the platform at Waterloo. He was slightly astonished, therefore, when the two faced him, together with Bates. A dramatic explanation of their presence was soon supplied. "These gentlemen, sir, are Chief Inspector Winter and Detective Inspector Furneaux of Scotland Yard," said the ex-sergeant, in the awed tone which some people cannot help using when speaking of members of the Criminal Investigation Department. Though daylight had not yet failed, it was rather dark in that corner of the station, and Thaden saw now what he had not perceived earlier, that the usually sedate Bates was pale and harassed-looking. "Why, what's up?" he inquired, gazing blankly from one to the other of the ominous pair. "Haven't you seen the evening papers, Mr. Thaden?" said Winter, the giant of the two. "No, I've been at Brooklands since 2 o'clock. But what is it? You don't know, then, that a murder was committed in the Innismore Mansions last night or early this morning?" "Good Lord, no. Who was killed?" "A Mrs. Lester, the lady. Mrs. Lester, who lives in number 17. Yes. What a horrible thing. Why, only the day before yesterday I met her on the stairs." It was a banal statement, and Thaden knew it, but he blurted out the first crazy words that would serve to cloak the monstrous thought which leaped into his brain. And a picture danced before his mind's eye. A picture, not of the fair and gracious woman who had been done to death, but of a sweet-voiced girl in a white satin dress who was saying to a fine-looking man standing by her side, "Dad, aren't you coming home with me?" His blurred senses were conscious of the strange medley produced by the familiar noises of a railway station blending with the quietly authoritative voice of the chief inspector. "Mr. Furneaux and I have the inquiry in hand, Mr. Thaden," the detective was saying. "We called at your flat, and Bates told us of the sounds you both heard about 11:30 last night. I'm afraid we have rather upset you by coming here, but Bates was unable to say what time you would return home, so I thought you would not mind if we accompanied him in order to find out the hour at which it would be convenient for you to meet us at your flat. This evening, of course." "You have certainly given me the shock of my life," Thaden gasped. "That poor woman dead? Murdered? It's too awful. How was she killed?" "She was strangled." "Oh, this is dreadful. Shall I wire an apology to the man I'm dining with?" "No need for that, Mr. Thaden," said Winter, sympathetically. "I'm sorry now we blurted out our unpleasant news. But you had to be told, and it was essential that we should get your story sometime tonight. Can you be home by 11? Yes. I'll be there without fail." "Thank you. We have a good many inquiries to make in the meantime. Goodbye, for the present." The two made off. Winter had done all the talking, but Thaden was far too disturbed to pay heed to the trivial fact that Furneaux, after one swift glance, seemed to regard him as a negligible quantity. It was borne in on him that the detective evidently believed he had something of importance to say, and meant to render it almost impossible that he should escape questioning while his memory was still active with reference to events of the previous night. And he had so little, yet so much, to tell. On his testimony alone, it would be a comparatively easy matter to establish beyond doubt the identity of Mrs. Lester's last known visitor. And what would be the outcome? He dared hardly trust his own too lively imagination. Whether or not his testimony gave a clue to the police, the one irrevocable issue was that somewhere in London there was a girl named Evelyn who would regard a certain young man, Francis Beryl Thaden to wit, as a loathsome and despicable Paul Pry. Bates, somewhat relieved by the departure of the emissaries of Scotland Yard, recalled his master's scattered wits to the affairs of the moment. "It's getting on for 7, sir," he said. "I've engaged a dressing room. Tell you what, Bates," said Thaden abstractedly, "it is my fixed belief that you and I could do with a brandy and soda apiece." "That would be a good idea, sir." The good idea was duly acted on. While Thaden was dressing, Bates told him what little he knew of the tragedy, which was discovered by Mrs. Lester's maid when she brought a cup of tea to her mistress' bedroom at 10 o'clock that morning. Bates himself was the first person appealed to by the distracted woman, and he had the good sense to leave the body in its surroundings untouched until a doctor and the police had been summoned by telephone. Thenceforth the day had passed in a whirl of excitement, active in respect to police inquiries and passive in its resistance to newspaper interviews. He saw no valid reason why his employer's plans should be disturbed, so made no effort to communicate with him at Brooklands. "Them texts were very pressing, sir," said Bates, rather indignantly. "Very pressing, especially the little one. He almost wanted to know what we had for breakfast." At that Thaden laughed dolefully, and, as it happened, Bates's grim humor prevented him from ascertaining the exact nature of Furneaux's pertinacity. Moreover, the time was passing. At 7:15 Thaden called a taxi and was carried swiftly to Mr. Forbes's house in Belgravia, while Bates disposed himself in the dressing case on top of a northbound omnibus. The mere change of clothing, aided by the stimulant, had cleared Thaden's faculties. Though he would gladly have foregone the dinner, he realized that it was not a bad thing that he should be forced, as it were, to wrench his thoughts from the nightmare of a crime with which such a man as Evelyn's father might be associated, even innocently. At any rate, he was given some hours to marshal his forces for the discussion with the representatives of Scotland Yard. He knew well that he must then face the dilemma boldly. Two courses were open. He could either share Bates's scanty knowledge, no more and no less, or avow his ampler observations. And why should he adopt the first of these alternatives? Was he not bringing himself practically within the law? Why should any man be shielded, no matter what his social position or how beautiful his daughter, who might possibly have caused the death of the pleasant-mannered and ladylike woman fated now to remain forever a tragic ghost in the memory of one who had dwelt under the same roof with her for 5 months? It was a thorny problem, yet it permitted of only one solution. Duty must be done though the heavens fell. This conviction grew on Thaden as his cab scurried across the Thames and along Birdcage Walk. A pretty conceit could not be allowed to sweep aside the first principles of citizenship. Indeed, so reassuring was this reasoned judgment that he felt a sense of relief as he paid off the cab and rang the bell of the Forbes mansion. He gave his name to a footman, who disposed of his overcoat and hat, and led him to an upstairs drawing-room. Even the most fleeting glances at hall and staircase revealed evidences of a highly trained artistic taste gratified by great wealth. The furniture, the china, the pictures, were each and all rare and well chosen. "Mr. Thaden," announced the man, throwing wide the door. A lady, bent over some prints spread on a distant table, turned at the words, and hastened to greet the guest. "My father is expecting you, Mr. Thaden," she said. "He was detained rather late in the city, but will be here now at any moment." Thaden was no neurotic boy, whose surcharged nerves were liable to crack in a crisis demanding some unusual measure of self-control. Yet the room and its contents, and, not least, the graceful girl advancing with outstretched hand, swam before his eyes. Because this was Evelyn, and it was certain as the succession of night to day that Mrs. Lester's mysterious visitor must have been Evelyn's father, James Creighton Forbes. Chapter 2. The Compact. So petrified was Thaden by coming face to face with the last person breathing whom he expected to meet in that room, that he stumbled over a small chair which lay directly between him and his hostess. At any other time the gaucherie would have annoyed him exceedingly. In the existing circumstances, no more fortunate incident could have happened, since it brought Evelyn Forbes herself unwittingly to the rescue. "I have spoken 20 times about chairs being left in that absurd position," she cried, as their hands met. "But you know how wooden-headed servants are. They will not learn to discriminate. People often sit in that very place of an afternoon, because anyone seated just there sees the canaletto on the opposite wall in the best light. When the lamps are on, the reason for the chair simply ceases to exist, and it becomes a trap for the unwary. You are by no means the first who has been caught in it." Thaden realized, with a species of irritation, that the girl was discoursing volubly about the offending chair merely in order to extricate an apparently shy and tongue-tied young man from a morass of his own creation. That an author of some note should not only behave like a country bumpkin, but actually seem to need encouragement so that he should feel at home in a London drawing-room, was a fact so ridiculous that it spurred his bemused wits into something approaching their normal activity. "I have not the excuse of the canaletto," he said, compelling a pleasant smile. "But may I plead an even more distracting vision? I came here expecting to meet an elderly gentleman of the class which flippant Americans describe as highbrow, and I am suddenly brought face to face with a Romney portrait of a lady in real life. Is it likely that such an insignificant object as a chair, and a small one at that, would succeed in catching my eye?" Evelyn Forbes laughed, with a joyous mingling of surprise and relief. Most certainly, Mr. Thaden's manner of speech differed vastly from the disconcerting expression of positive bewilderment, if not actual fright, which marred his entrance. "Do I really resemble a Romney?" "Which one?" she cried. "An admitted masterpiece." "Ah, but people who pay compliments deserve to be put on the rack. I insist on a definition. Lady Hamilton as Joan of Arc." He drew the bow at random, and was gratified to see that his hero was puzzled. "I don't know that particular picture," she said, "but I cannot imagine any model less adapted to the subject." "Romney immortalized the best qualities of both," he answered promptly. Please, may I look at the canaletto which indirectly waylaid me? She turned to cross the room, but stopped and faced him again with a suddenness that argued an impulsive temperament. Now, I remember, she said. Dad told me you had written novels and some essays. Have you ever really seen Romney's portrait of Lady Hamilton as Joan of Arc? Those fine eyes of hers pierced him with a glance of such candid inquiry that he cast pretense to the winds. No, he said. Then you just invented the comparison as an excuse for colliding with the chair. Yes. At the same time, I throw myself on the mercy of the court. It was rather clever of you. He laughed, and their eyes met, at very close range. May I share the joke, said a voice, and Thaden knew, before he turned, that the man he had last seen disappearing around the corner of Innismore Mansions in a heavy rainstorm was in the room. Why did you tell me that Mr. Thaden was a serious scientific person? Cried the girl. He is anything but that. He can talk nonsense quite admirably. So can a great many serious scientific persons. Evelyn. Glad to see you, Mr. Thaden. Professor Scarther's letter paved the way for something more than a formal meeting, so I thought you wouldn't mind giving us an evening. My wife is not in town. She is a martyr to hay fever, and has to fly from London to the sea early in May to escape. If caught here in June, nothing can save her. Tonight, as it happens, you're our only guest, but my daughter is going to a musicale at Lady de Winton's after dinner, so you and I will be free to soar into the Empyrean through a blaze of tobacco smoke. Standing there, in that delightful drawing room, made welcome by a man like Forbes, and admitted to a degree of charming intimacy by a girl like Forbes's daughter, Thaden tried to believe that his meeting with those ill-omened detectives at Waterloo Station was, in some sort, a figment of the imagination. But he was instantly and effectually brought back to a dour sense of reality by Evelyn Forbes's next words. She, by chance, looked at Thaden just as she had looked at him the previous night. Were you at Daly's Theatre last night? She inquired suddenly. Yes, he said. Then, finding there was no help for it, he went on. You and I have hit on the same discovery, Miss Forbes. We three stood together at the exit. I was waiting for a taxi, and saw you get into your car. Now you know just why I fell over the chair. Forbes glanced up quickly. Don't tell me Tomlinson forgot to move that infernal chair again, he cried. Really? I must get rid either of our butler or the canaletto, yet I prize both. Don't blame Tomlinson, Dad, laughed the girl. If Mr. Thaden hadn't made an unconventional entry, we would have talked about the weather, or something equally stupid. At that moment Tomlinson himself, imperturbable and portly, announced that dinner was served. The three descended the stairs, chatting lightly about the musical comedy witnessed overnight. It was no new revelation to Thaden that truth should prove stranger than fiction, but the trite phrase was fast assuming a fresh and sinister personal significance. He believed, and not without good reason, that no man living had ever undergone an experience comparable with his present adventure. When he left that house, he was going straight to two officers of the law whose bounden duty it would become to call upon Mr. Forbes for a full and true explanation of his visit to Mrs. Lester, provided, that is, he, Thaden, told them what he knew. Talk about a death's head grinning at a feast. At that bright dinner table he was a prey to keener emotion than ever shook a Borgia entertaining one whom he meant to poison. In sheer self-defense he talked with an animation he seldom displayed. Evelyn was evidently much taken by him, and, fired by her manifest interest, he indulged in fantastic paradox and wild flights of fancy. Seemingly his exuberance stimulated Forbes, himself a well-informed and epigrammatic talker. An hour sped all too soon. The girl rose with a sigh. It's too bad that I should have to go, she said. I shall be bored stiff at Lady de Winton's. But I can't get out of it except by telling a positive fib over the telephone. Dad, next time you ask Mr. Thaden to dinner, please let me know in good time, and neither of you will be rid of me so easily. She shook hands with Thaden. While she was giving her father a parting kiss, the guest moved to the door and held it open. As she passed out she smiled and her eyes said plainly, I like you. Come again soon. Then she was gone and the pleasant room lost some of its glow and color. Don't sit down again, Thaden, said Forbes, rising. We'll have coffee brought to my den. What is your favorite liqueur? Or shall we tell Tomlinson to send along that decanter of port? It's a first-rate wine. Another glass won't hurt you, or me, for that matter. Thaden had hardly dared to touch the champagne supplied during the meal. Abstemious at all times, Because he found that wine or spirits interfered with his capacity for work, he felt that a clear head and steady nerves were called for that night more than any other night in his life. Following the lead given by his host, therefore, he elected for the port. "You are right, too," said Forbes. "You remember Dr. Johnson's dictum. Claret is a liquor for boys, port for men. But he who aspires to be a hero must drink brandy. Tonight, not aspiring to the heroic, we'll stick to port." "It is a curious fact that on my return from Brooklands today I took a glass of brandy," confessed Thaden. "I seldom, if ever, drink any intoxicant before dining. But I needed a stimulant of a sort, and some unknown tissue in me cried aloud for brandy." He hoped vaguely that the comment would lead to something more explicit, and thus bring him, without undue emphasis, so to speak, to the one topic on which he was now resolved to obtain a decisive statement from the man chiefly concerned before he faced the representatives of Scotland Yard. But Forbes, motioning to an easy chair in a well-appointed library, and flinging himself into another, gave heed only to the one word, "Brooklands." "Did you fly?" he asked. "No. I was soaking in theory, not practice." "Ah, theory." It would, indeed, seem to be true that folded away in some convolution of our brain are the faculties of the fish and the bird. Those latent powers are expanding daily. The submarine has already gone far beyond the practical achievement of aerial craft. But why, in the name of humanity, should every such development of man's almost immeasurable resources be dedicated to warlike purposes? I am sick at heart when I hear the first question put in these days to each inventor. Can you enable us to kill more of our fellow men than we can kill with existing appliances? Is it a new engine, a new amalgam of metals, a new explosive, a new field of electrical energy? One hears the same vulture's cry. How many, how far, how safely can we slay? I regard this lust for destruction as contemptible. It is a strange and ignominious feature of modern life. Forgive me, Mr. Thaden, if I speak strongly on this matter. The men who spread the bounds of science today are, nominally, at any rate, Christians. They tell of peace and goodwill to all, yet prepare unceasingly for some awful Armageddon. Asterisk. We teach Christ's gospel in pulpit and schoolhouse, strive to express it in our laws, obey it in our lives and social relations. Yet we are armed to the teeth and ever arming, adding strength to the plates of our warships and distance to the range of our guns, constantly riveting and welding and forging monsters which shall shatter men and cities and states. This story was written before the outbreak of war in 1914. It was not the younger man now who talked brilliantly and forcibly. Thaden, frankly abandoning the effort to twist the conversation to that enigma which, the more he saw and heard of Forbes, the more incredible it became, listened enthralled to one who spoke with the conviction and earnestness of a prophet. "Don't imagine that I am framing an indictment against Christianity," went on Forbes passionately. "The Sermon on the Mount inspires all that is great and noble in our everyday existence, all that is eternally beautiful in our dreams of the future. But why this din of war, this smoke of arsenals, this marching and drilling of the world's youth? Nature's law appears to have two simple clauses. It enforces a principle in the struggle for existence, a test in the survival of the fittest. Great heavens, are not these enough, without having our ears deafened by powder and drumming? That is why I am devoting a good deal of time and no small amount of money to an international crusade against the warlike idea, and I see no reason why a beginning should not be made with the airship and the airplane. We are too late with the submarine. But, before the golden hour passes, let us stop the navigation of the air from forming part of the equipment of murder. Surely it can be done. England and the United States, Italy, France, and the rest of Europe, the founts of civilization, can write the edict, with all the blazonry of their glorious histories to illuminate the page. There shall be no war in the air. Thaden was carried away in spite of himself. "You believe that the airship might develop along the unemotional lines of the parcel post?" he inquired. Forbes laughed. "Exactly," he said. "I like your simile. No one suggests that we Britons should endeavor to destroy our hated rivals by sending bombs through the mails. Why, then, in the name of common sense, should the first, I might almost say the only use of which the airship is commonly supposed capable, be that of destruction? Don't you see the instant result of a war-limiting ordinance of the kind I advocate? Suppose the peoples and the rulers declared in their wisdom that soldiers and war material should be contraband of the air, And suppose that airships do become vehicles of practical utility. What a farce would soon be all the grim fortresses, the guns, the giant steel structures now designed as floating hells. Humanity has yet time to declare that the flying machine shall be as harmless and serviceable as the penny post. I believe it can be done. Come now, Mr. Thaden, I think you've caught on to my scheme. Will you help? Help! Here was a man expounding a new evangel, which might, indeed, be visionary and impracticable, but was nonetheless essentially noble and Christian in spirit. Yet Thaden was debating whether or not he should give testimony which would bring to that very room a couple of detectives whose first questions would make clear to Forbes that he was suspected of blood guiltiness. The notion was so utterly repellent that Thaden sighed deeply. His host not unnaturally looked surprised. Of course, such a revolutionary idea strikes you as outside the pale of common sense, he began, but the younger man stayed him with a gesture. Here was an opportunity that must not be allowed to pass, no matter what the cost. If he never saw Evelyn Forbes or her father again, he must dispel the waking nightmare which held him in such an abnormal condition of uncertainty and foreboding. Now that your daughter is gone, I may venture to speak plainly, he said. I told you that. I felt the need of a brandy and soda at Waterloo. As a matter of fact, I did not leave the Brooklands track until 6 o'clock, and, as Innismore Mansions, where I live, lie north, and I was due here at 7:30. I had my man meet me at the station with a suitcase, meaning to change my clothes in the dressing room there, and come straight here. Guess my astonishment when I found Bates. Bates is the name of my factotum, in the company of two strangers, whom he introduced as representing the Criminal Investigation Department. He paused. He had brought in his own address skillfully enough, and kept his voice sufficiently under control that no tremor betrayed a knowledge of Forbes's vital interest in any mention of that one block of flats among the multitude. Now, for the first time, Innismore Mansions figured as his abode, the correspondence which led to the dinner having centered in his club. But not a flicker of eyelid nor twitch of mobile lip showed the slightest concern on Forbes's part. Rather did he display at once a well-bred astonishment on hearing Thaden's concluding words. "Do you mean detectives from Scotland Yard?" he cried. "Yes." Forbes smiled, and commenced filling a pipe. "Evidently they did not want you as a principal," he said. His tone was genial, but slightly guarded. Thaden realized that this man of great wealth and high social position had reminded himself that his guest, though armed with the best of credentials, was quite unknown to him otherwise, and that, perhaps, he had acted unwisely in inviting a stranger to his house without making some preliminary inquiry. This reversal of their roles was a conceit so ludicrous that Thaden smiled too. At any rate, he meant now to pursue an unpleasing task, and have done with it. "No," he said slowly. "It seems that I am the worst sort of witness in a murder case. I may have heard, I may even have seen, the person suspected of committing the crime, or, if that is going too far, the person whom the police have good reason to regard as the last who saw the poor victim alive and in ordinary conditions. But my testimony, such as it is so slight and inconclusive that, of itself, no one could hang a cat on it." "Good gracious! That sounds interesting, though you have my sympathy. It must be rather distressing to be mixed up in such an affair, even indirectly." Forbes struck precisely the right note of friendly inquiry. He wished to hear more, and was at the same time relieved to find that Professor Scarth had not introduced a notorious malefactor in the guise of a young writer seeking material for an article on airships. Thaden could have laughed aloud at this comedy of errors, but the fact that at any moment it might develop into a tragedy exercises a wholesome restraint. "I happen to live at number 18 Innismore Mansions," he said. "Opposite, on the same floor, I mean, lives, or did live, a Mrs. Lester." "I do not." "Are you telling me that a Mrs. Lester of number 17 Innismore Mansions is dead, has been murdered?" Forbes's voice rang out vibrant, incisive. His ordinarily pale face had blanched, and his deep-set eyes blazed with the fire of some fierce emotion. But, beyond the slight elevation of tone and the change of expression, he revealed to Thaden's quietly watchful scrutiny no sign of the terror or distress which an Evaldor might be expected to show on learning that the law's vengeance was already shadowing him, even in so remote a way as was indicated by the presence under his roof of a witness regarded by the police as an important one. "Yes," stammered Thaden, quite taken aback by his companion's vehemence. "Do you know the lady? If so, I am sorry. I spoke so unguardedly." "Good heavens, man, don't apologize for that. I am not a child or weakling, that I should flinch in horror from one of life's dramatic surprises. But, are you sure of what you are saying? Mrs. Lester murdered. When? About midnight last night, the doctor believes. That is what Bates told me. I was so shaken on hearing his news, which was confirmed by the two detectives, that I really gave little heed to details. She was strangled, a peculiarly atrocious thing where an attractive and ladylike woman is concerned. I have never spoken to her, but have met her at odd times on the stairs. I was immeasurably shocked, I assure you. In fact, I was on the point of telegraphing an excuse to you for this evening, but the Chief Inspector, Winter, I think his name is, said it would suffice for his purpose if I met him at my flat about 11 o'clock, as he was engaged on other inquiries which would occupy the intervening hours. But if the news of this dastardly crime only reached you tonight at Waterloo Station, and you have no personal acquaintance with Mrs. Lester, what evidence can you give that will assist the police? Mrs. Lester received a visitor last night, an incident so unusual that I, who heard him arrive, and Bates, who was in my sitting room when we both heard him depart, commented on the strangeness of it. That, I suppose, is the reason why I am in request by Scotland Yard. You say him. How did you know it was a man? Did you see him? Oh, that was impossible. We were in my flat, behind its closed door. Bates and I deduced his sex from the sound of his footsteps. Again Thaden nearly stammered. Events had certainly turned in the most amazing way. Instead of carrying himself almost in the manner of a judge, he was figuring rather as an unwilling witness in the hands of a skilled and merciless cross-examining counsel. Did the police officers supply any theory of motive for the crime? Was this poor woman killed for the sake of her few trinkets? By this time Thaden was stung into a species of revolt. It was he, not Forbes, who should be snapping out searching questions. I regret to say that my nerves were not sufficiently under control at Waterloo that I should listen carefully to each word, he said, almost stiffly. Bates had picked up such information as was available, but he, though an ex-sergeant in the army, was so upset as to be hardly coherent. When I meet the detectives in the course of another hour, I shall probably gather something definite and reliable in the way of details. Forbes laid the pipe which he had filled but not lighted on the table. He poured out a glass of port and drank it. Try that, he said, pushing the decanter toward Thaden. They cannot trouble you greatly. You have so little to tell. No, thanks. Nothing more for me tonight until the Scotland Yard men have cleared out. Forbes rose as he spoke and strode the length of the room and back with the air of a man debating some weighty and difficult point. Mr. Thaden, he said, at last, halting in front of the younger man and gazing down at him with a direct intensity that was highly embarrassing to one who had good cause to connect him with the actual crime. I want you to do me a favor, a great favor. It was in my mind at first to ask you to permit me to go with you to Innismore Mansions, and to be present during the interview with the detectives. But a man in my position must be circumspect. It would, perhaps, be unwise to appear too openly interested. I don't mind telling you in confidence that I have known Mrs. Lester many years. The shock of her death, severe as it must have been to you, is slight as compared with my own sorrow and dismay. More than that I dare not say until better informed. I remember now hearing the newsboys shouting their Gaulish news, and I saw contents bills making large type display of murder of a lady. But little did I imagine that the victim was one whose loss I shall deplore. Are you on the telephone? Yes, said Thaden, thoroughly mystified anew by the announcement that Forbes had even contemplated, or so much as hinted at, the astounding imprudence of visiting Innismore Mansions that night. Ring me up when the detectives have gone. I shall esteem your assistance during this crisis as a real service. For the life of him, Thaden could not frame the protest which ought to have been made without delay and without hesitation. Yes, he said. I'll do that. You can trust me absolutely. Thus was he committed to secrecy. That promise sealed his lips. Chapter 3. In the Toils. Thaden, though blessed, or cursed, with an active imagination, which must surely be the prime equipment of a novelist, was shrewd and level-headed in dealing with everyday affairs. It was no small achievement that the son of a country rector, aided only by a stout heart, a university education and an excellent physique, good recommendations, each and all, but forming the stock-in-trade of many a man on whose subsequent career failure is writ large, should have forced himself to the front rank of the most overcrowded among the professions before attaining his 26th year. It may be taken for granted, therefore, that he was not lacking in the qualities of close observation and critical analysis. He would, for instance, be readier than the majority of his fellows to note the small beginnings of events destined to become important. Often, of course, his deductions would prove erroneous, but the mere fact that he habitually exercised his wits in such a way rendered it equally certain that his judgment would be accurate sometimes. One such occasion presented itself a few seconds after he had left the Forbes mansion. A taxi, summoned by a footman, was in waiting, and Thaden was crossing the pavement when he noticed a grey landaulet car at rest beneath the trees at some distance. Mr. Forbes's house stood in a square, and the grey car had been drawn up on the quiet side of the roadway, being stationed there, apparently, to await its owner's behest. Grey cars are common enough in London, but they are usually of the touring class. Not often does one see a grey-painted landaulet. Hence, the odd though hardly remarkable fact occurred to Thaden that a precisely similar grey automobile had occupied the centre of the station yard at Waterloo when he took a taxi from the rank. Admittedly, he was in a nervous and excited state. It could hardly be otherwise after the strain of that astounding conversation with Forbes, and there was no prospect of the tension being relaxed until the close of the interview with the detectives, which he now regarded as the worst ordeal of the two. But this subconscious neurasthenia in no wise affected the reflex action of his ordinary faculties. When, on leaving the square, and while his cab was rattling along an aristocratic thoroughfare leading to Knightsbridge, he peered through a tiny observation window in the back of the vehicle, and ascertained that the grey car was stealing along quietly about 100 yards in the rear, he began to believe that its presence both at Waterloo and outside Mr. Forbes's residence could not be wholly accidental. When he had watched its persistent treading on his heels along Piccadilly, its intent became almost unmistakable. The route to Innismore Mansions traversed some of London's main arteries, but, despite the rush of traffic due to the first flight of homeward-bound playgoers, the grey car kept steadily on his track. Amused at first, he became angry because of a notion which grew out of the wonderment of finding himself the object of this persistent espionage. To make sure, and at the same time discover the sort of person who was spying on him, he adopted a ruse. Leaning out, when about to cross Oxford Street into Tottenham Court Road, he said to his driver, "Turn sharp to the right in Store Street, and pull up. I'll tell you when to go on again." The man obeyed. Thaden posted himself at the outer window, and in a space of time so short that the excellence of the grey car's accelerator was amply demonstrated, the pursuer swung into sight. A stolid-faced chauffeur at the wheel did not appear discomfited at coming on his quarry thus unexpectedly. He whirled past, seemingly quite oblivious of Thaden's fixed stare. Though the weather was mild, he wore an overcoat with upturned collar, so that between its protecting flaps and a low-peaked cap his face was well hidden. Still, Thaden received an impression of a curiously wooden physiognomy. The man might have been an automaton for all the heed he gave to the taxi or its inquisitive occupant. But his aspect was almost forgotten in the far stranger discovery that the car was empty. Both windows were open, and the bright lights of a corner shop flashed into the interior, yet not a soul was visible. Moreover, the car sped on unhesitatingly, stopping some 200 yards ahead. So far as Thaden could tell, no one alighted. He jotted down the number, XY1314, on his shirt cuff. "Did you happen to see that car waiting near the house I came from?" he said to the taxi man, who, of course, provided an interested audience of one. "Yes, sir," was the ready answer. "It's not a London car. I've never seen them letters afore. In other words, it may be a fake number. Likely enough, sir, but rather risky. The police are quick at spotting that sort of thing. Can you take a hand in the game? I want to know where that car goes to." The man grinned. "I wouldn't like to humbug you, sir. That there machine can lose me quicker'n a Derby winner could pass a cab horse. Didn't you hear the hum of the engine as it went by? Thanks. Now go ahead to Innismore Mansions." He was paying the driver when the grey car stole quietly past the end of the street, and that was the last he saw of it. "There it goes again, sir," said the man. "Tell you what, give me your name and address. I'll make a few inquiries, and keep me eyes open as well. Then, if I hear anything, I'll let you know." Thaden scribbled the number of his flat on a card. "There you are," he said. "Even if I happen to be out, I'll leave instructions that you are to be paid £half-a-crown for your trouble if you call. By the way, what is your name?" "Evans, sir." There was really little doubt in Thaden's mind as to the reason why he had been followed. He was fuming about it when Bates met him in the hall of number 18 with the whisper, Them two are waiting here now, sir. Thaden glanced at his watch. The hour was 10 minutes past 11. Sorry I'm late, gentlemen, he said, on entering the sitting room and finding the detective seated at his table, seemingly comparing notes, because the chief inspector was talking, while Furneaux, the diminutive, was glancing at a notebook. We have no reason to complain of being kept waiting a few minutes in such comfortable quarters, said Winter pleasantly. Oh, I fancy I was detained by some zealous assistant of yours, said Thaden, determined to carry the war into the enemy's territory. At that Furneaux looked up quickly. Will you kindly tell me just what you mean, Mr. Thaden, said Winter. Why? Is it news to you that a grey limousine car stalked me from Waterloo to my friend's house, waited there 3 hours or more, and has carefully escorted me home? I dislike that sort of thing. Moreover, it strikes me as stupid. I didn't kill Mrs. Lester. It will save you and me a good deal of time and worry if you accept that plain statement as a fact. Won't you sit down, said Winter quietly. And, may I smoke? I didn't like to ask Bates for permission to light up in your absence. Thaden was not to be outdone in coolness. He opened a corner cupboard and produced various boxes. The cigars are genuine Havanas, he said. A birthday present from a maiden aunt, who is wise enough to judge the quality of tobacco by the price. Here, too, are Virginian, Turkish, and Egyptian cigarettes. Winter inspected the cigars gravely. By Jove, he cried, his big eyes bulging in joyous surprise. Last year's crop from the Don Juan y Guerrero plantation. Treasure that aunt of yours, Mr. Thaden. None but herself can be her equal. Thaden saw that the little man did not follow his chief's example. Don't you smoke? He said. No, but if you'll not be horrified, I would like to smell one of those Turks. Smell it? Yes. That is the only way to enjoy the aroma and avoid nicotine poisoning. My worthy chief dulls a sound intellect by the cigar habit. What is worse, he excites a nervous system which is normally somewhat bovine. You, also, I take it, are a confirmed smoker, so both of you are at cross purposes already. Furneaux's voice was pitched in the curious piping note usually associated with comic relief in a melodrama, but his wizened face was solemn as a Red Indian's. It was Thaden who smiled. His preconceived ideas as to the appearance and demeanor of the London detective were shattered. Really, there was no need to take these too seriously. Winter, while lighting the cigar, grinned amiably at his colleague. Furneaux passed a cigarette to and fro under his nostrils and sniffed. Thaden reached for a pipe and tobacco jar and drew up a chair. Well, he said, it is not my business to criticize your methods. I have very little to tell you. I suppose, Bates, the really important thing is this car which followed you tonight, broke in Winter. The details are fresh in your memory. What type of car was it? Did you see the driver and occupants? What's its number? Thaden had not expected these questions. He looked his astonishment. Ha, cackled Furneaux. What did I tell you? Oh, shut up, growled Winter. I'm asking just what you yourself are itching to know. May I take it that the car has not been dogging me by your instructions, said Thaden. He was inclined to be skeptical, yet the chief inspector seemed to have spoken quite candidly. Yes, said Winter, meeting the other's glance squarely. We have no reason on earth to doubt the truth of anything you have said, or may say, with regard to this inquiry. The car is not ours. This is the first we have heard of it. We accepted your word, Mr. Thaden, that you were dining with a friend. Perhaps you will tell us now what his name is and where he lives. Thaden hesitated the fraction of a second. That, he knew instantly, was a blunder, so he proceeded to rectify it. I was dining with Mr. James Creighton Forbes, of number 11, Fortescue Square, he said. Probably you are acquainted with his name, so you will realize that if my evidence proves of the slightest value, I would not like any reference to be made to the fact that I was his guest tonight. I don't see how that can possibly enter into the matter, except in its bearing on this mysterious car. Though Winter was taking the lead, Thaden was aware that Furneaux, who had given him scant attention hitherto, was now looking at him fixedly. He imagined that the queer little man was all agog to learn something about the automobile which had thrust itself so abruptly into the affair. Exactly, he agreed. I visited Mr. Forbes tonight for the first time. We are mutually interested in aviation. That is why I went to Brooklands today, and the invitation to dinner was the outcome of a letter of introduction given me by Professor Scarth. Then, thinking he had said enough on that point, He described the gray car and its stolid-faced chauffeur to the best of his ability. He told of the brief chat with the taxi driver and its result. "Good," nodded Winter. "I'm glad you did that. It may help. I am doubtful of any information turning up, but you never can tell. The number plate, at any rate, is certainly misleading. Now, about last night? Try and be as accurate as possible with regard to time. Can you give us the exact hour when you returned home?" "I happened to note by the clock on the mantelpiece that I came in at 11:35. Winter compared the clock's time with his watch. "You had been to a theater," he said. "Yes, Daly's. It was raining heavily. Did you take a cab?" "Yes." "Were you delayed?" "The piece ended at 11:05. My cab met with a slight accident." "What sort of accident?" Thaden explained. "In all likelihood you can discover the driver," he smiled, "and he will establish my alibi." His tone seemed to annoy Furneaux, who broke in. "Don't you write novels?" "Yes. Sensational. Occasionally. Then you ought to be tickled to death, as the Americans say, at being mixed up in a first-rate murder. This is no ordinary crime. Several people will be older and wiser before the culprit is found and hanged. What Mr. Furneaux has in mind," purred Winter cheerfully, "is the curious habit of some witnesses when questioned by the police. They arm themselves against attack, as it were. You see, Mr. Thaden, we suspect nobody. We try to ascertain facts, and hope to deduce a theory from them. Over and over again we are mistaken. We are no more astute than other men. Our sole advantage is a wide experience of criminal methods. The detective of romance, if you'll forgive the illusion, simply doesn't exist in real life." "I accept the rebuke," said Thaden. "I suppose the gray car was still rankling in my mind. From this moment I start afresh. At any rate, the man who brought me from the theater might check my recollection of the time." Winter nodded. He was evidently pleased that Thaden was inclined to share his view of the difficulties Scotland Yard encountered in its fight against malefactors. "Did you see or meet anyone in particular while your car approached these mansions, or when you ascended the stairs?" "No," said Thaden. He perceived intuitively that if the detectives found the driver of the taxi which brought him from the theater, it was possible the man might have noticed Forbes, who had certainly been scrutinized a few minutes later by a policeman, so he hastened to add, "You said anyone in particular. I did see a tall, well-dressed gentleman at the corner of the street, but there is nothing remarkable in that." "Which way was he heading?" "In this direction." "Then it is conceivable that he might be the man who called on Mrs. Lester." "Yes. Aren't you pretty sure he was the man?" Thaden permitted himself to look astonished. "Aye," he said. "How can I be sure?" "If you mean that, judging from the interval of time between my seeing him at the corner and the sound of footsteps on the stairs, followed by the opening of the door at number 17, it could be he. I accept that." Winter nodded again. Apparently he was content with Thaden's correction. "As the weather was bad, you probably hurried in when your cab stopped," he said. "That is equivalent to saying you credit me with sense enough to get in out of the wet," smiled Thaden. "Just so. And you wore an overcoat, which you removed on entering your hall." "Yes," and Thaden's tone showed a certain bewilderment at these trivialities. "Then if you paid no special heed to the movements of the tall gentleman you have mentioned, why did you open one of these windows and look out soon after Bates went to the post?" Thaden flushed like a schoolboy caught by a master under circumstances which youth generally describes as a clean cop. "How on earth do you know I looked out?" he almost gasped. "I'll tell you willingly. The discovery was Mr. Furneaux's, not mine. When we came here this morning, and ascertained that you had been out at a late hour last night, we asked your man if he could enlighten us as to your movements. He did so. To the best of his belief you dined at a club, and occupied a stall at Daly's Theatre subsequently. He was sure, too, you had not walked home through the rain, so it was easy to draw the conclusion that you returned in a covered vehicle. Mr. Furneaux requested Bates to produce the clothes you had worn, which, owing to the uproar created by the news of the murder, had not been brushed and put away. As a consequence, the silk collar and part of the back of your dress coat bore the marks of raindrops. How had they got there? The only logical deduction was that you had thrust your head and shoulders through a window, and the time of the action is established almost beyond doubt, because you had changed the coat when Bates came from the pillar box. It was either directly after you came in, or while Bates was absent. Of course you may have looked out twice. Did you? Whether once or twice. Why did you do it? Thaden's feelings changed rapidly while Winter was delivering this very convincing analysis of a few simple facts. He had passed at a bound from the detected schoolboy stage to that of a man forcing his way through a thicket who finds himself on the very lip of a precipice. He remembered hazily that Bates had said something at Waterloo with regard to the manner in which the detectives, especially Furneaux, had questioned him. But it was too late to apply the warning thus conveyed. If he faltered now, he was forever discredited. These men would read his perplexed face as if it were a printed page. In his distress he was prepared to hear Winter or that little satyr, Furneaux, say mockingly, "Why are you trying to screen James Creighton Forbes? What is he to you? What matter his fame or social rank? We are here to see that justice is done. Out with the truth, let who may suffer." But neither of the pair said anything of the sort. Furneaux only interjected a sarcastic comment. "You will observe, Mr. Thaden, that even in a minor instance of deductive reasoning, such as this, the man who smells rather than the man who smokes tobacco solves the problem promptly." Thaden threw out his hands in token of surrender. He thought he saw a means of escape, and took it unhesitatingly. "I'm vanquished," he said. "You force me to admit that I do know a little, a very little, more than I have confessed hitherto about the man who visited Mrs. Lester's flat last night. I have said nothing about the matter thus far because I didn't want to be convicted of a piece of idle curiosity worthy of a gossip-loving housemaid. I noticed the man I have described staring at the name tablet of the street as my cab turned the corner. I did not know him. I had never seen him before last night, but he was of such distinguished appearance and his face was of so rare a type that I was interested and wished to ascertain, if possible, on whom he meant calling if, as it seemed, he was searching for an address in these flats. Therefore, I did look out, and saw him enter the doorway beneath. In due course I heard him arrive at Mrs. Lester's door. That is, I assume it was he. 5 minutes later Bates and I heard him depart. To make sure, I looked out a second time. If you ask me why I behaved in that way, I cannot tell you. I have occupied this flat during the past 5 months, and I have never previously, within my recollection, lifted a window and gazed out to watch anybody's comings and goings. The thing is inexplicable. All I can say is that it just happened. Would you recognize him if you saw him again? Yes. Thaden gave the assurance readily. It was beyond credence that either detective should put the one question to which he was now firmly resolved to give a misleading answer. And in this belief he was justified, since not even Furneaux's uncanny intelligence could suggest the fantastic notion that the man who walked through the rain the previous night and the man with whom Thaden had dined that evening were one and the same person. "I don't blame you for adopting a policy of partial concealment," said the chief inspector, spryly. "You are not the first, and you certainly will not be the last witness from whom the police have to drag the facts. Now that we have reached more intimate terms, can you help by describing this stranger?" Thaden complied at once. He drew just such a general sketch of Forbes as a skilled observer of men might be expected to formulate after one direct glance close at hand, supplemented by a view into a lamplit street from a second-story window on a rainy night. "So far, so good," said Winter. "You have contrived to fill in several details lacking in the description supplied by a policeman who chanced to be standing at the corner when Mrs. Lester's visitor posted a letter. Did you notice that?" "Yes, indeed. I believe that, whether intentionally or not, he held an open umbrella at an angle which prevented the constable from seeing his face. In fact, it's marvelous what you really do know when your memory is jogged," snapped Furneaux. Thaden did not resent the sarcasm. He smiled candidly into the little detective's eyes. "I suppose I deserve that," he said meekly. "Why did you hide your knowledge of Mrs. Lester's visitor from your man Bates?" "I was rather ashamed of the subterfuge adopted in order to get him out of the room while I opened the window the first time. That was understandable last night, but I failed to follow your reasoning for a policy of silence when we told you at Waterloo that Mrs. Lester had been killed. I was utterly taken aback by your news. I wanted time to think. I never meant to hide any material fact at this interview. You have contrived to delay and hamper our inquiry for 12 hours, 24 in reality. I can't make you out, Mr. Thaden. You would never have said a word about your very accurate acquaintance with this mysterious stranger's appearance had not last night's rainstorm left its legible record on your clothes. Do you now vouch for it that the man was completely unknown to you? You are pleased to be severe, Mr. Furneaux, but, having placed myself in a false position, I must accept your strictures. I assure you, on my honor, that the man I saw was an absolute stranger." Happily, Thaden was under no compulsion to choose his words. He met the detective's searching gaze unflinchingly. Fate, after terrifying him, had been kind. If Furneaux had expressed himself differently, if, for instance, he had said, "Had you ever before seen the man? Or have you now any reason for believing that you know his name?" he would have forced Thaden's hand in a way he was far from suspecting. "It may surprise you to hear," piped the shrill, cracked voice, "that there are dozens of policemen walking about London who would arrest you on suspicion had you treated them as you have treated us." "Then I can only say that I am fortunate in my inquisitors," smiled Thaden. Winter held up a massive fist in deprecation of these acerbities. "You have nothing more to tell us?" he queried. "Nothing. Then we need not trouble you further tonight. Of course, if luck favors us and we find the gentleman with the classical features, the most unlikely person to commit a murder I have ever heard of, we shall want you to identify him. I am at your service at any time. But before you go, won't you enlighten me somewhat? What did really happen? I have not even seen a newspaper account of the crime. Would you care to examine number 17? It was Furneaux who put the question, and Thaden was genuinely astonished. "Do you mean?" he began, but Furneaux laughed, almost savagely. "I mean Mrs. Lester's flat," he said. "The poor woman's body is at the mortuary. If you come with us, we can reconstruct the crime. It occurred about this very hour if the doctor's calculations are well-founded." Thaden rose. "I shall be most interested," he said. "By the way, Mr. Furneaux, yours is a French name. Are you a Frenchman, may I ask?" "A Jersey man. You think I am adopting some of the methods of the French juge d'instruction, eh?" "No. I cannot bring myself to believe that you regard me as a murderer." The three passed out into the hall. Mr. and Mrs. Bates immediately showed scared faces at the kitchen door. "It's all right, Bates," said Thaden airily. "I'm not a prisoner. I'll be with you again in a few minutes." But Bates was profoundly disturbed. "What beats me," he said to his wife when they were alone, "is why that little ferret wanted to see the governor's clothes. I looked him over carefully afterwards, and there wasn't a speck on him except some spots of rain on the coat collar. It's a queer business, no matter how you look at it." Mr. Thaden's manner was strange when he came in last night. He seemed to be listening for something. "I don't know what to make of it, Eliza. I really don't. In effect, since no man is a hero to his valet, what would Tomlinson, butler at number 11 Fortescue Square, have thought of his master if told that Mrs. Lester's last known visitor was James Creighton Forbes? Chapter 4. A Telephonic Talk and Its Consequences. Thaden's journalistic experiences had been, for the most part, those of the special correspondent or descriptive writer. He had never entered one of those fetid slums of a great city in which, too often, murder is done, never sickened with the physical nausea of death in its most revolting aspect, when some unhappy wretch's foul body serves only to further pollute air already vile. It was passing strange, therefore, that Winter had no sooner opened the door of number 17 than the novice of the party became aware of a heavy, pungent scent which he associated with some affrighting and unclean thing. At first he swept aside the fantasy. Strong as he was, his nervous system had been subjected to severe strain that evening. He knew well that the mind can create its own spectres, that the five senses can be subjugated by forces which science has not as yet either measured or defined. Moreover, he was standing in a hall furnished with a taste and quiet elegance that must surely indicate similar features in each room of a suite which, in other respects, bore an almost exact resemblance of his own apartments. In sheer protest against the riot of an overwrought imagination, he brushed a hand across his eyes. The chief inspector noted the action. "You will find nothing gruesome here, I assure you," he said, quietly. "Beyond a few signs of hurried rummaging of drawers and boxes, there is absolutely no indication of a crime having been committed." "Mr. Thaden came prepared to see ghosts," squeaked Furneaux. "Evidently he is not acquainted with the peculiar smell of a joss stick." Thaden turned troubled eyes on the wizened little man who seemed to have the power of reading his secret thought. "A joss stick," he repeated. "Isn't that some sort of incense used by Chinese in their temples?" "Yes," said Furneaux. "Lots of ladies burn them in their boudoirs nowadays," explained Winter offhandedly. "The Chinese burn them to propitiate evil spirits," murmured Furneaux. "The Tao gods are mostly deities of a very unpleasant frame of mind. The mere scowl of one of them from a painted fan suggests novel and painful forms of torture. I've seen Shang-Ti grinning at me from a porcelain vase, otherwise exquisite, and felt my hair rising. "I do wish you wouldn't talk nonsense, Charles," said Winter, frowning heavily. "Am I talking nonsense, Mr. Thaden?" demanded Furneaux. "Didn't your flesh creep when that queer perfume assailed your nostrils, which are not yet altogether atrophied by the reek of thousands of rank cigars?" "Stop it," commanded Winter, throwing open a door. "And they christened him Leander." "Leander, who swam the Hellespont for love of a woman," muttered Furneaux. Thaden began to believe that both detectives were cranked of the first order. Furneaux, whose extraordinary insight he actually feared, was obviously an excellent example of the alliance between insanity and genius. In a word, he failed, and not unreasonably, to understand that when the Jersey man was mouthing a strange jargon of knowledge and incoherence, and Winter was inclined to be snappy with his subordinate, and each was more than rude to the other, they were then giving tongue like hounds hot on the trail. Winter's Christian names were James Leander, the latter being conferred for no more classical reason than his father's association with a famous boating club, but the fact supplied Furneaux with material for many a quip. These things Thaden learnt later. At present he was giving all his attention to Winter, who led the way into a dainty furnished bedroom. The electric lights were governed by two switches. A pair of lamps occupied the usual place in front of a dressing table. A third was suspended from a canopy over the bed, and was controlled also by an alternate switch behind the bolster. Winter turned on all three lights, so the room was brilliantly illuminated. Any place less likely to become the scene of a brutal crime could hardly be imagined. It looked exactly what it was, the bedchamber of a refined and well-bred woman, whose trained sense of color and design was shown by the harmony of carpet, rugs, wallpaper, and furniture. Winter pointed to a slight depression on the side of the bed. A white linen coverlet was rumpled as though someone had sat there. "That is where Ann Rogers, the maid, found her mistress at 10 o'clock this morning," he said. "As you see, the bed had not been slept in. Indeed, Mrs. Lester was fully dressed. My belief is that she was pounced on the instant she entered the room, probably to retire for the night, strangled before she could utter a sound, and flung here when dead." Again Thaden was aware of the subtle, penetrating, and not wholly unpleasing scent which Furneaux had attributed to the burning of a joss stick, but his mind was focused on the detective's words, which suggested a queer discrepancy between certain vague possibilities already flitting through his brain and the terrible drama as it presented itself to a skilled criminologist. "But," he said, almost protestingly, "from what I have seen of Mrs. Lester, she was a strong and active woman. It is inconceivable that the man who came here last night could have murdered her while I was writing two brief notes. I am positive he did not remain 5 minutes, and Bates or I, or both of us, must have heard some trampling of feet, some indications of a struggle. Moreover, you think she was about to retire. Doesn't that opinion conflict with the known facts?" "What known facts?" "Well, all those I have mentioned. The brief visit, the open nature of the arrival and departure, the posting of a letter, which, by the way, may have been written in his presence. It was—" Thaden positively jumped. He would not be surprised now if Forbes's name came out. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Mrs. Lester wrote to an aunt in Oxfordshire, a lady who lives in the village of Iffley, near the first lock on the Thames below Oxford. As it happened, this aunt, a Miss Beale, was lunching with a friend in Oxford today, and someone showed her an early edition of a London evening newspaper containing an account of the murder. Instead of yielding to hysteria and passing from one fainting fit into another, Miss Beale had the rare good sense to go straight to the police station. One of our men has interviewed her this evening, and she is coming here tomorrow. But in the meantime, the Oxford police telephoned the gist of the letter, which is headed Monday 11:30 p.m. The hour is not quite accurate, but near enough, since the context shows that a friend had just called and given certain information which had determined the writer to leave London tomorrow, meaning today, or Wednesday at latest. So you see, Mr. Thaden, if the unknown is an honest man, he will soon hear of the hue and cry raised by the murder, and declare himself to the police. Indeed, for all I know, he may have reported himself to the Yard already. In that event you will probably meet him again quite soon." An electric bell jarred at the end of the main passage. It smote on their ears with the loud emphasis of a pistol shot. Even the detectives were startled, and Winter said, in a tone of distinct annoyance, "Go and see who the deuce that is, Furneaux." Furneaux returned promptly with Bates, pallid and apologetic. "Beg pardon, sir," said the intruder, addressing Thaden, but allowing his eyes to roam furtively about the room as though he expected to see something ghoul-like and sinister. "Mr. Forbes has rung up." Thaden's voice literally quavered. For the first time in his life he knew why a woman shrieks in the stress of sudden excitement. "Tell Mr. Forbes I am still engaged with the gentleman from Scotland Yard," he gasped. "I'll give him a call the moment I'm free. He will understand. Anyhow, I can't explain further now." "Yes, sir." And Bates disappeared. "Mr. Forbes? The gentleman you were dining with?" inquired Winter. "Yes," said Thaden. He knew he ought to add something by way of explanation, but his heart was thumping madly, and he dared not trust his voice. "You told him, I suppose, that Scotland Yard was worrying you, and he wants to know the result." Then Thaden saw an avenue of escape, and took it eagerly. "I spoke of the murder, of course," he said, but Mr. Forbes was hardly interested. He had seen the newspaper placards, and that was all he knew of it. "The truth is, he is wholly wrapped up in a scheme for reforming mankind by excluding airships and aeroplanes from warlike operations, and found me a somewhat preoccupied listener. He wants my help, such as it is, and I have no doubt the present call is a preliminary to another meeting tomorrow. Why not go to him? We'll wait. We can do nothing more tonight after leaving here. Speaking candidly, I am not in a mood to discuss such visionary projects. I shall be glad if Mr. Forbes has gone to bed when I do ring him up." Winter shook his head. "Excuse me, Mr. Thaden, but I am older than you, and may venture on advice," he said. "A writer who has his way to make in the world cannot afford to slight a man of Mr. Forbes's standing. Go to him at once. It will please him. Don't hurry." Thaden realized that a continued refusal would certainly set Furneaux's wits at work, and he dreaded the outcome. He went without another word. When the outer door had closed behind him, Winter turned to Furneaux. "Well," he said. For answer, Furneaux waved a hand and tiptoed into the hall. Waiting until he heard the door of number 18 slam, he opened the latch of number 17 so cautiously that no sound was forthcoming. Soon he had an ear to Thaden's letterbox and was following attentively a one-sided conversation. Now, Thaden had thought hard during the few strides from one flat to the other. His telephone was fixed close to the party wall dividing the two sets of apartments, and he was not certain that, in the absolute quietude prevailing in Innismore Mansions at that late hour, a voice could not be overheard. True, he did not count on Furneaux playing the eavesdropper at the slit of the letterbox, but he resolved to take no risks and say nothing that anyone could make capital of. So, when he had asked the exchange to reconnect him with the caller who had just rung up, and he was put through, this is what Furneaux heard. "That you, Mr. Forbes? Sorry I sent my man just now with a message that must leave," sounded rather curt, "but the Scotland Yard people kindly excuse me, so I can give you a minute or two." "No, I'm sorry, but I cannot come to luncheon tomorrow, nor go to Brooklands again this week. You see, this dreadful murder which I spoke of will necessitate my presence at an inquest, and the police seem to attach much significance to the visit to Mrs. Lester last night of a man whom I saw in the street, and whom Bates and I heard entering and leaving the poor lady's flat." "Bates? Oh, he is my general factotum. He and his wife keep house for me." "Yes, I'll gladly let you know the earliest date when I'll be free. Then you and I can go into the flying proposition thoroughly." "No, the detectives have apparently not got any clue to the murderer, nor even discovered any motive for the crime. They have taken me into number 17. In fact, I was there when your call was made. The murderer ransacked the place thoroughly, but did not touch money or jewelry, I understand. The only peculiar thing, if I may so describe it, about the place, is the scent of a burnt joss stick. It clings to the passage and the bedroom in which the body was found. Ah, by the way, Mrs. Lester wrote a letter, which her visitor posted, and the addressee, her aunt, is in communication with the police. The text tends to clear the man of suspicion. Yes, if, by chance, I find myself at liberty tomorrow, I'll phone you at your city office. I'll find the number in the directory, of course." "Oh, thanks. I'll jot it down, 00400 back. Good night. Too bad that this wretched affair should interfere with our crusade, which, the more I think of it, the stronger it appeals. Au revoir." Then, in reality, Forbes had not said one word about his peace propaganda, but he had evidently been quick to realize that Thaden was purposely giving their talk a twist in that direction. A muttered, "I understand," perfectly, showed this, and he did not strive to conceal the alarm which possessed him when Thaden spoke of the joss stick. He murmured distinctly, "Great heavens! Then I was not mistaken," and again voiced his distress on hearing of the letter. But he made matters easy by pressing Thaden to come and see him on the morrow, either at his office in Old Broad Street or at his residence. On the whole, Thaden did not care who heard what he had said, but it was a relief to find that he had to ring for readmission to number 17. Furneaux opened the door. "You soon got rid of your friend, then," said the detective, while they were on the way to rejoin Winter. "Yes. It was just what I imagined. A pressing invitation to plunge forthwith into Mr. Forbes's project for the regeneration of mankind. I had to tell him frankly that you gentlemen had first claim on me. I suppose I shall be wanted at the inquest. Not tomorrow. The coroner will hear the medical evidence, and that of Anne Rogers, if she is in a condition to appear, and there will be an adjournment for a week. Ah, that reminds me. Didn't Mrs. Lester's servant admit the visitor last night?" Thaden put the question advisedly. He was calmer now, and had made up his mind as to the course he should pursue. Although he had assured Winter that he would recognize the stranger if confronted with him, and, if Forbes was brought into the inquiry, the admission might prove awkward. He meant to say that he had, indeed, noticed a remarkable resemblance in the millionaire to the man he had seen looking up at the name tablet on the corner, but felt that the likeness was only one of those singular coincidences which abound in a cosmopolitan city. The smartest cross-examiner at the bar could not shake him if he took that stand. The sheer improbability of Forbes being the mysterious visitor would justify his attitude, and the notion was so consoling that he faced the two detectives with new confidence and a self-possession that was exceedingly pleasant when compared with his earlier embarrassment. "No," said Winter. "By a most remarkable chance, Anne Rogers was given leave to spend the night with her father, who lives in Camden Town. He is an old man and was taken ill last evening. He believes he asked someone to telegraph to his daughter, asking her to come to him. She certainly received a telegram and as certainly did visit him. Of course, that phase of the affair will be cleared up thoroughly, but the main facts are indisputable. And Rogers has her own latchkey. As Mrs. Lester usually sat up late, being a lover of books, and seldom stirred before 10 o'clock, the maid waited until that hour before bringing her mistress's cup of tea. That stain on the carpet near the door shows where the tray fell from her hands. Sometimes an artist obtains the strongest effect by one deft sweep of the brush. Winter, though he would have blushed if described as an artist in words, had achieved a similar result by his concluding sentence. Thaden pictured the scene. He saw the limp form thrown across the bed, the distorted face, the hands and arms posed grotesquely. He heard the shrill scream of the terrified servant, an elderly woman whom Bates described as a quiet body, and could imagine the clatter of the laden tray as it dropped from nerveless fingers. A sort of fury rose within him. Mrs. Lester had been done to death in a horrible and insensate way, and no matter who suffered, be he millionaire or pauper, the wretch who committed the crime should be made to pay the penalty of the law. In that moment he forgot Evelyn Forbes, and thought only of the fair and gracious woman whose agonized spirit had taken flight under the compulsion of the tiger grip of some human brute now moving among his fellow creatures unknown and unsuspected. It was inconceivable that Forbes should be guilty, but why should he not avow his acquaintance with the victim, and thus aid the police in their quest? He glowered savagely at the telltale stain, and vowed to rid his conscience of an incubus. He would wait till the morrow and force Forbes to come out into the open. Otherwise, you wish you had the murderer here now. Furneaux spoke softly, and with no trace of his wonted irony, but Thaden was aware that once more the little detective had peered into his very soul. "Yes," he said, and there was a new gravity in his tone. "I do wish that. I have never before been brought in contact with a crime of this magnitude. It conveys a sort of personal responsibility. To think that I was in my room, reading about aviation, while a woman's life was being choked out of her within a few feet of where I was seated. Oh, it is monstrous. Let me tell you too, here and now, that if I can do anything to bring Mrs. Lester's slayer to justice, you can count on me, no matter what the cost." "I'm sure you mean what you say, Mr. Thaden," said Winter soothingly. "Well, I suppose we can do no more tonight. I have little else to tell you." "The skull, the ivory skull," put in Furneaux. For an instant an expression of annoyance flitted across the chief inspector's good-humored face. Thaden did not see it, because Furneaux's odd-sounding words caused him to look with astonishment at the man who uttered them. "An ivory skull," he cried. "What has an ivory skull to do with the murder of Mrs. Lester?" "We cannot even begin to guess at its meaning yet," said Winter, who, after one fierce glance at his colleague, had recovered his poise. "That is why I did not mention it. I hate the introduction of bizarre features into an inquiry of this sort. But, now that the thing has been spoken of, I may as well state that when the medical examination was being made at the mortuary, a tiny skull, not bigger than a pea, and made of ivory, was found inside Mrs. Lester's underbodice. The curious fact is that it was loose. Had it been attached to a cord, or secured in some way, one might regard it as a charm or amulet. Because some women, even in the London of today, are not beyond the reach of superstition in such matters. But, as I say, it was not safeguarded at all, so we may reasonably assume that it was not carried habitually. Of course, Furneaux readily evolved a far-fetched theory that it is a sign, or symbol, and was thrust out of sight among the clothing on the dead woman's breast by the man who killed her. But that is idle guesswork. We of the Yard seldom pay heed to theatrical notions of that kind. Here is the article. I don't mind letting you see it, but kindly remember that its existence must not be made known. I must have your promise not to mention it to a living creature." Furneaux chuckled derisively. "That is precisely the sort of thing anybody would say who attached no importance to the exhibit," he piped. Winter so nearly lost his temper that he repressed the retort on his lips. He contented himself, however, with producing a small white object from his waistcoat pocket, and handed it to Thaden. It was a bit of ivory, hollow, and very light, and fashioned as a skull. Yet, it was by no means an ordinary creation. The artist who fashioned it had gratified a morbid taste by imparting to the eyeless sockets and close-set rows of teeth a malign and threatening grin. Wickedness, not death, was suggested, but the craftsmanship was faultless. A collector would have paid a large sum for it, while the average citizen would refuse to have it in his house. "What an extraordinary thing," said Thaden, turning the curio round and round in his fingers. "It's wonderfully well carved," agreed Winter. "From that point of view, it's a masterpiece. But what I meant was the astounding fact that it should have been discovered on the dead woman's body. Was it placed over her heart?" "Why do you ask that?" came the sharp demand. "Because, if it is a token of some vendetta, if the murderer wished to signify that he had glutted his vengeance." "Oh, you're as bad as Furneaux," cried Winter impatiently. "Give it to me. I must be off. The hour is long past midnight and I have a busy day before me tomorrow." Back in the seclusion of his own rooms, Thaden debated the question whether or not he should endeavor to communicate with Forbes again that night. Somehow it seemed to him that Forbes would be most concerned at hearing of the grey car. And what of the ivory skull? Suppose he knew of that? But a certain revulsion of feeling had come over Thaden since the sheer brutality of the murder had been revealed. He failed to see now why he should be so solicitous for Forbes's welfare. No matter what private purpose the man might serve by concealing his visit to Mrs. Lester, it ought to give way before the paramount importance of tracking a pitiless and callous criminal. So Thaden hardened his heart and went to bed, and, being sound in mind and constitution, slept like a just man wearied. Nevertheless, the last thing he saw before the curtain fell on his tired brain was an ivory skull dancing in the darkness. Greatly as the many problems attached to Mrs. Lester's death bewildered him, he would have been even more perplexed if he had overheard the conversation between Winter and Furneaux when they entered a taxi and gave Scotland Yard as their destination. "Look here, Charles," began Winter firmly. But the other stayed him with a clutch of thin, nervous fingers on an arm strong enough to fell an ox. "Listen first, James. Lecture me afterward," pleaded Furneaux. "I can't help yielding to impulse. And why should I strive to help it? Anyhow, how often has impulse led me to the goal when by every known rule of evidence I was completely beaten? That is my plea. That is why I brought that young fellow into number 17 and watched the story of the tragedy reshaping itself in his imagination. That is why, too, I spoke of the ivory skull. Think what it means to one with the writer's temperament. The skull will never leave his mind's eye. It will focus and control his thoughts and actions. And I feel it in my bones that only by keeping in touch with Mr. Francis Thaden shall we solve the Innismore Mansion's mystery. I can't explain why I think this, no more than the receiver of a wireless message can account for the waves of energy it picks up from the void and transmutes into the ordered sequences of the Morse code. All I know is that when I am near him I am, as the children say, warm, and when away from him, cold. While he was examining the skull I was positively hot, and was half inclined to treat him as a thought transference medium and order him sternly to speak. No, be calm. I even bid you be honest. When have you, ever before, admitted an outsider to your counsels? And, if you make an exception of Thaden, why are you doing it? Winter bit the end off a cigar with a vicious jerk of his round head. He struck a match and created such a volume of smoke that Furneaux coughed affectedly. The real clue, he said at last, rests with the grey car. What did you make of that? That, my bulky friend, will figure in my memory as a reproach for many a year. When, if ever, I am tempted to preen myself on some peculiarly close piece of ratiocinative reasoning, I shall say, little man, pygmy, remember the grey car. You think that someone had the impudence to follow us, watch us in Waterloo, and take up Thaden's trail when we had revealed it. Aha! It touched you, too, did it? But why? The someone in question wants to know that. You mean they are anxious to find out what we are doing? Exactly. Winter laughed cheerfully. Before long I shall begin to enjoy this hunt, Charles. I like to find originality in a felon. It varies the routine. At any rate, it is something new that you and I should be shadowed by the very people we are in pursuit of. Oh, I was nearly forgetting. Anything fresh in that telephone talk? It seemed all right. Seemed? Well, it was too straightforward. Thaden puzzles me. I admit it frankly. He also worries me. But let me handle him in my own way. Have no fear that he will use our material for newspaper purposes. With regard to the Innismore Mansions affair, Thaden will lie close as a fish. Why? No use asking you, of course. You despise intuition. When you die someone should begin your epitaph, from information received. But I'll stick to Thaden. See if I don't, even if I have to go up with him in one of Forbes's airships. Chapter 5. A Leap in the Dark. With the morning, Thaden brought a mature and impartial judgment to bear on his perplexities. The average man, if asked to form an opinion on any difficult point, will probably arrive at a saner decision during the first pipe after breakfast than at any other given hour of the day. Excellent physiological reasons account for this truism. The sound mind in a sound body is then working under the most favorable conditions. It is free from the strain of affairs. The cold, clear morning light divests problems of the undue importance, or, it may be, the glamour of novelty, which they possessed overnight. At any rate, Frank Thaden, clenching a pipe between his teeth, and gazing thoughtfully through an open window at the trees in Innismore Gardens, reviewed yesterday's happenings calmly and critically, and arrived at the settled conviction that his proper course was to visit Scotland Yard and make known to the authorities the one vital fact he had withheld from their ken thus far. It was not for him to assess the significance of Mr. Forbes's desire to remain in the background. If the millionaire's excuse, or explanation, of his failure to communicate at once with the Criminal Investigation Department was a sufficiently valid one, Scotland Yard would be satisfied and might agree to keep his name out of the inquiry. On the other hand, he, Thaden, might be balking the course of justice by holding his tongue. There was yet a third possibility, one fraught with personal discredit. Mr. Forbes himself might realize that a policy of candor offered the only dignified course. Suppose he was minded to tell the detectives that he was a man who visited Mrs. Lester shortly before midnight. What would Winter and Furneaux think of the young gentleman who had actually dined with Forbes before they took him into their confidence, who heard with such righteous indignation how Mrs. Lester met her death, yet brazenly concealed the fact that he had just left the house of one whom they were so anxious to meet and question? Of course, the radiant vision of Evelyn Forbes intruded on this well-considered and unemotional analysis. But Thaden resolutely shook his head. No, by Jove, he communed. You mustn't make an ass of yourself, my boy, because a pretty girl was gracious for an hour or so. Be honest with yourself, old chap. If there were no Evelyn, or if Evelyn were hair-lipped and squinted, you wouldn't hesitate a second. Now, would you? Yet he had given a promise. How reconcile an immediate call on Scotland Yard with the guarantee of secrecy demanded by Forbes? Well, he must put himself right with Forbes without delay. Tell him straightforwardly that the bond could not hold. Thaden was no lawyer, but he was assured that an agreement founded on positive wrong was not tenable, legally or morally. He would be adamant with Forbes, and decline to countenance any plea in support of continued silence. If Forbes's demand was reasonable, Scotland Yard would grant it. If justice compelled Forbes to come out into the open, no private citizen should attempt to defeat the ends of justice. So that settles it, announced Thaden firmly if not cheerfully. I'll ring up Forbes and get the thing over and done with. I'll never see his daughter again, I suppose, but that can't be helped. 'Tis better to have seen and lost than never to have seen at all. He turned from the window, walked to the fireplace, tapped his pipe firmly on the grate, and was about to go into the hall and call up the telephone exchange, when the doorbell rang. He was aware of a muffled conversation between Bates and a visitor. Then the valet appeared, obviously ill at ease. "If you please, sir," he announced, "a lady, a Miss Beale, of Oxford, who says she is Mrs. Lester's aunt, wishes to see you." Thaden was immensely surprised, as well he might be. But there was only one thing to be done. "Show her in," he said. Miss Beale entered. She was slight of figure, middle-aged and grey-haired. The wanness of her thin features was accentuated by an attire of deep mourning, but the pallor in her cheeks fled for an instant when she set eyes on Thaden. "Pray forgive the intrusion," she faltered. I expected to meet an older man." It was a curious utterance, and Thaden tried to relieve her evident nervousness by being mildly humorous. "I hope to correct my juvenile appearance in course of time," he said, smiling. "Meanwhile, won't you be seated? You are not quite unknown to me, Miss Beale. That is, I heard of you last night from the Scotland Yard people." She sat down at once, but seemed to be at a loss for words. Her lips trembled, and Thaden thought she was going to cry. "Have you travelled from Oxford this morning?" he said, simulating a courteous nonchalance he was far from feeling. "If so, you must have started from home at an ungodly hour. Let me have some breakfast prepared for you." No, she stammered. "Well, a cup of tea, then? Come, now, no woman ever refuses a cup of tea." "You are very kind." He rang the bell. "I would not have ventured to call on you if I had not seen your name in the newspaper," she went on. Miss Beale certainly had the knack of saying unexpected things. It was nothing new that Thaden should find his own name in print, but on this occasion he could not choose but associate the distinction with the crime in number 17. That he should be mentioned in connection with it was neither anticipated nor pleasing. At the same time he realized the astounding fact that he had not even glanced at a newspaper during 24 hours. "What in the world have the newspapers to say about me?" he cried. It said that Mr. Francis Berold Thaden, the well-known author, lived in number 18, the flat exactly opposite that which my unhappy niece occupied. I have read some of your books, Mr. Thaden, and I pictured you quite a serious-looking person of my own age." He laughed. Bates entered, and was almost shocked at finding his master in such lively mood. "Oh, this lady has travelled from Oxford this morning. A cup of tea and some nice toast, please, Bates," said Thaden. Then when the two were alone together again, he brushed aside the question of his age as irrelevant. "I assure you that since this time yesterday I have lost some of the careless buoyancy of youth," he said. "I had not the honor of Mrs. Lester's acquaintance, but I knew her well by sight, and I received the shock of my life last evening when I heard of her terrible end. It is an extraordinary thing, seeing that we were such close neighbors, but I believe you got the news long before I did, because I left home early and heard nothing of what had happened till my man met me at Waterloo in the evening. You have seen the detectives in the meantime?" "Yes." "Then you will be able to tell me something definite. I have promised to call at Scotland Yard at 11 o'clock, and the only scraps of intelligence I have gathered are those in the papers. I would have come to London last night, but was afraid to travel, lest I should faint in the train. Moreover, someone in London promised to send a detective to see me. He came, but could give no information. Indeed, he wanted to learn certain things from me. So, after a weary night, I caught the first train, and it occurred to me, as you lived so near, that you might be kind enough to. The long speech was too much for her, and her lips quivered pitifully a second time. "I fully understand," said Thaden sympathetically. "Now, I'm positive you have eaten hardly anything today. Won't you let me order an egg?" "No, please. I'll be glad of the tea, but I cannot make a meal, yet. Is it true that my niece was absolutely alone in her flat on Monday night?" Seeing that Miss Beale was consumed with anxiety to hear an intelligible version of the tragedy, Thaden at once recited all, or nearly all, that was known to him. The only points he suppressed were those with reference to the grey car and the ivory skull. The lady listened attentively and with more self-control than he gave her credit for. Bates came in with a laden tray, on which a boiled egg appeared. Mrs. Bates had used her discretion, and decided that anyone who had set out from Oxford so early in the day must be in need of more solid refreshment than tea and toast. Thus cozened, as it were, into eating, Miss Beale tackled the egg, and Thaden was glad to note that she made a fairly good meal, being probably unaware of her hunger until the means of sating it presented itself. But she missed no word of his story, and when he made an end, put some shrewd questions. "I take it," she said, "that the strange gentleman who visited my niece on Monday night posted the very letter which I received by the second delivery yesterday." "That is what the police believe," replied Thaden. "Then it would seem that she resolved to come to me at Iffley as the result of something he told her." "Why do you think that?" "Because I heard from her only last Saturday, and she not only said nothing about coming to Oxfordshire, but asked me to arrange to spend a fortnight in London before we both went to Cornwall for the summer." "Ah, that is rather important, I should imagine," said Thaden thoughtfully. "It is odd, too, that you and the detective should have noticed the smell of a joss stick in the flat," went on Miss Beale. "Edith, my niece, you know, could not bear the smell of joss sticks. They reminded her of Shanghai, where she lost her husband." Thaden looked more startled than such a seemingly simple statement warranted. He had realized already that the ivory skull was the work of an Oriental artist, and the mention of Shanghai brought that sinister symbol very vividly to his mind's eye. "Mrs. Lester had lived in China, then?" he said. "Yes. She was out there nearly 6 years. Her husband died suddenly last October. He was poisoned, she firmly believed, and, of course, she came home at once." "What was Mr. Lester's business, or profession?" "He was a barrister. I do not mean that he practiced in the consular courts. He was making his way in England, but was offered some sort of appointment in Shanghai. The post was so lucrative that he relinquished a growing connection at the bar. I have never really understood what he did. I fancy he had to report on commercial matters to some firm of bankers in London, but he supplied very little positive information before Edith and he sailed. Indeed, I took it that his mission was highly confidential, and about that time there was a lot in the newspapers about rival negotiators for a big Chinese loan, so I formed the opinion that he was sent out in connection with something of the sort. Neither he nor Edith meant to remain long in the Far East. At first their letters always spoke of an early return. Then, when the years dragged on, and I asked for definite news of their homecoming, Edith said that Arthur could not get away until the country's political affairs were in a more settled state. Finally came a cablegram from Edith. "Arthur dead. Sailing immediately." And my niece was with me within a few weeks. The supposed cause of her husband's death was some virulent type of fever. But, as I said, Edith was convinced that he had been poisoned. Why? That I never understood. She never willingly talked about Shanghai, or her life there. Indeed, she was always most anxious that no one should know she had ever lived in China. Yet she had plenty of friends out there. I gathered that Arthur had left her well provided for financially, and they were a most devoted couple. Edith was the only relative I possessed. It is very dreadful, Mr. Thaden, that she should be taken from me in such a way. Her hero was almost thankful that she yielded to the inevitable rush of emotion. It gave him time to collect his wits, which had lost their poise when that wicked-looking little skull was, so to speak, thrust forcibly into his recollection. "In a word," he said, at last, "you are Mrs. Lester's next of kin and probably her heiress." "Yes, I suppose so, though I was not thinking of that," came the tearful answer. "Yet the relationship entails certain responsibilities," said Thaden firmly. "You should be legally represented at the inquest. Are your affairs in the hands of any firm of solicitors?" "Yes, at Oxford. I contrived to call at their office yesterday, and they recommended me to consult these people," and Miss Beale produced a card from a handbag. Thaden read the name and address of a well-known West End firm. "Good," he said. "I recommend you to go there at once. By the way, was anyone looking after Mrs. Lester's interests? Surely she had dealings with a bank or an agency." "Why, yes. I do happen to know the source from which her income came. She made a secret of it, in a measure. Pray don't tell me anything of that sort. Your legal adviser might not approve. But what does it matter now? Poor Edith is dead. Her affairs cannot help being dragged into the light of day. She had some railway shares and bonds, some of which were left to her by her father, and others which came under a marriage settlement. but the greater part of her revenue was derived from a monthly payment made by the bank of which Mr. James Creighton Forbes is the head. Miss Beale naturally misinterpreted the blank stare with which Thaden received this remarkable statement. "I don't see why anyone should wish to conceal a simple matter of business like that," she said nervously. "May I explain that I have an impression, not founded on anything quite tangible, that Mr. Forbes was largely interested in the syndicate which sent Arthur Lester to China, so it is very likely that the payment of an annuity, or pension, to Arthur's widow would be left in his care. I do not know. I'm only guessing. But that matter, and others, can hardly fail to be cleared up by the police inquiry." Thaden recovered his self-control as rapidly as he had lost it. He glanced at the clock. 10:15. Within half an hour, or less, Miss Beale would be on her way to Scotland Yard. He must act promptly and decisively, or he would find himself in a distinctly unfavorable position in his relations with the Criminal Investigation Department. "I happen to be acquainted with Mr. Forbes," he said, striving desperately to appear cool and methodical when his brain was seething. "Would you mind if I just rang him up on the telephone? A few words now might enlighten us materially." "Oh, you are most helpful," said the lady, blushing again with timid gratitude. "I am so glad I summoned up courage to call on you. I was terrified at the idea of going to the police headquarters, but I shall not mind it at all now." Soon Thaden was asking 400-400 bank. He had left the door of his sitting room open purposely. No matter what the outcome, he no longer dared keep the compact of silence into which he had entered with Forbes. But the millionaire was not at his office. In response to a very determined request for a word with someone in authority, on a matter of real urgency, the clerk who had answered the call brought Mr. Forbes's secretary, a Mr. MacDonald, to the telephone. "It is important, vitally important, that I should speak with Mr. Forbes within the next few minutes," said Thaden, after giving his name and address. "Do you expect him to arrive soon? Or shall I try and reach him at Fortescue Square?" "Mr. Forbes will not be here till midday," came a voice with a pronounced Scottish intonation. "I'm doubtful, too, if you'll catch him at home. Can I give him a message? Do you know where he is?" "Well, I cannot say. But do you know? I'll be glad to give him a message. It will be too late, then. Please understand, Mr. MacDonald, that I am making this call at Mr. Forbes's express wish. It is, as I have said, vitally important that I should get in touch with him without delay." Scottish caution was not to be overcome by an appeal of that sort. "I cannot go beyond what I have said," was the reply. "If you like to ask at his house—" "Oh, ring off," cried Thaden, who pictured the secretary as a lanky, hollow-cheeked Scot, a model of discretion and trustworthiness, no doubt, but utterly unequal to a crisis demanding some measure of self-confident initiative. In reality, Mr. MacDonald was short and stout, and quite a jovial little man. After an exasperating delay, he got into communication with the Forbes mansion in Fortescue Square. "I'm Mr. Frank Thaden," he said, striving to speak unconcernedly. "Is Mr. Forbes in?" "No, sir." "Is that you, Tomlinson?" "Yes, sir." "Can you tell me where I can find Mr. Forbes at once?" "Isn't he at his office, sir?" "No. He will not be there till 12 o'clock. A pause of indecision on Tomlinson's part. Then, a possible solution of the difficulty. "Would you care to have a word with Miss Evelyn, sir?" "Oh, yes, yes." Thaden blurted out this emphatic acceptance of the butler's suggestion without a thought as to its possible consequences. He was racking his brain in a frenzy of uncertainty as to how he should frame his words when he heard quite clearly a woman's footsteps on the parquet flooring and caught Evelyn Forbes's voice saying to Tomlinson, "How fortunate. Mr. Thaden is the very person I wished to speak to. But I simply dared not ring him up." The slight incident only provided Thaden with a new source of wonderment. Why should Evelyn Forbes want speech with him at that early hour? Perhaps she would explain. He could only hope so, and trust to luck in the choice of his own phrases. "That you, Mr. Thaden?" came the girl's voice, sweet in its cadence yet ominously eager. "How nice of you to anticipate my unspoken thought. I have been horribly anxious ever since I read of that awful affair at Innismore Mansions. That poor lady's flat is next door to yours, is it not?" "Yes, but—" "Oh, you cannot choke off a woman's curiosity quite so easily. You see, I happen to know that Mrs. Lester's sad death affects my father in some way, and I realize now that you two were just on pins and needles to get rid of me last night so that you might talk freely. Miss Forbes, I assure you, Wait till I've finished, and you will not be under the necessity of telling me any polite fibs. You men are all alike. You think the giddy feminine brain is not fitted to cope with mysteries, and that is where you are utterly mistaken. A woman's intuition often peers deeper than a man's logic. Do forgive me, broke in Thaden despairingly, but I am really most anxious to know how and where I can get a word with your father. I would not be so rude as to interrupt you if I hadn't the best of excuses. Tell me where to find him now, and I promise to give you a call immediately afterward. Is it the Home Office? At the Home Office? Some hint of utter bewilderment in Thaden's tone must have reached the girl's alert ear. Touché, she cried. Now will you be good and tell me why Dad should receive a little ivory skull by this morning's post? Thaden knew that he paled. His very scalp tingled with an apprehension of some shadowy yet none the less affrighting evil. But he schooled himself to say, with a semblance of calm interest, "What exactly do you mean, Miss Forbes?" She laughed lightly. Thaden was so flurried that he did not realize the possibility of Evelyn Forbes being as quick to mask her real feelings as he himself was. "Dad and I make a point of breakfasting together at 9 o'clock every morning," she said. "We were talking about you, and he told me of the dreadful thing that happened to Mrs. Lester. I was reading the account of the tragedy in a newspaper when I happened to glance at him. He was going through his letters, and I was just a trifle curious to know what was in a flat box which came by registered post. He opened it carelessly, and something fell out and rolled across the table. I picked it up and saw that it was a small piece of ivory, carved with extraordinary skill to represent a skull. Indeed, it was so clever as to be decidedly repulsive. I was going to say something when I saw that the letter which was in the same box had alarmed him so greatly that, for a second or two, I thought he would faint. But he can be very strong and stern at times, and he recovered himself instantly, was quite vexed with me because I had examined the ivory skull, and forbade my going out until he had returned from the Home Office. Tomlinson and the other men have orders not to admit anyone to the house, no matter on what pretext, and I'm sure the letter and its nasty little token are bound up in some way with Mrs. Lester's death. Won't you let me into the secret? I shan't scream or do anything foolish, but I do think I'm entitled to know what you know if it affects my father." A sudden change in the girl's voice warned Thaden of a restraint of which he had been unconscious hitherto. He tried to temporize, to whittle away her fears. That was a duty he owed to Forbes, who was clearly resolved not to take his daughter into his confidence, for the present, at any rate. "I really fail to see why you should assume some connection between the crime which was committed here on Monday night and the arrival of a somewhat singular package at your house this morning," he said reassuringly. "Like every other woman, I jump at conclusions," she answered. "Why should this crime, in particular, have worried my father? Unfortunately, the newspapers are full of such horrid things, yet he hardly ever pays them any attention. No, Mr. Thaden, I am not mistaken. He either knew Mrs. Lester and was shocked at her death, or saw in it some personal menace. Then comes the letter, with its obvious threat, and I am ordered to remain at home, under a strong guard, while he hurries off to Whitehall. You have met my father, Mr. Thaden. Do you regard him as the sort of man who would rush off in a panic to consult the Home Secretary without very grave and weighty reasons? But you can hardly be certain that a wretched crime in this comparatively insignificant quarter of London supplies the actual motive of Mr. Forbes's action," urged Thaden. The girl stamped an impatient foot. He heard it distinctly. "Of course I am certain," she cried. "Why won't you be candid? You know I am right. I can tell it from your voice and your guarded way of talking." An inspiration came to Thaden's relief in that instant. "Pardon the interruption," he said, "but I must point out that both of us are acting unwisely in discussing such matters over the telephone. Really, neither must say another word, except this. When I have found your father, I'll ask his permission to come and see you. Perhaps we three can arrange to meet somewhere for luncheon. That is absolutely the farthest limit to which I dare go at this moment." "Oh, very well." The receiver was hung up in a temper, and the prompt ring-off jarred disagreeably in Thaden's ear. If he was puzzled before, he was thoroughly at sea now. But he took a bold course, and cared not a jot whether or not it was a prudent one. The mere sound of Evelyn Forbes's voice had steeled his heart and conscience against the dictates of common sense. Let the detectives think what they might. The girl's father must be allowed to carry through his plans without let or hindrance. "Miss Beale," said Thaden, gazing fixedly into the sorrow-laden eyes of the quiet little lady whom he found seated where he had left her, I'm going to tell you something very important, very serious, something so far-reaching and momentous that neither you nor I can measure its effect. You heard the conversation on the telephone. I heard what you were saying, but could not understand much of it, said his visitor in a scared way. I have been trying to communicate with Mr. Forbes, but his daughter tells me that the murder of your niece seems to have affected him in a manner which is incomprehensible to her, and even more so to me, though I am acquainted with facts which her father and I have purposely kept from her knowledge. Mr. Forbes has gone hurriedly to the Home Office. I suppose you know what that means? He is about to give the Home Secretary certain information, and it is not for you or me to interfere with his discretion. Now, if you tell the Scotland Yard people what you have told me, namely, that Mr. Forbes was the intermediary through whom Mrs. Lester received the greater part of her income, he will be brought prominently into the inquiry. You see that, don't you? Yes. I suppose that something of the sort must happen. Well, I want you to suppress that vital fact until we know more about this affair. It will not be for long. Each of us must tell our story without reservation at some future date. Whether this afternoon, or tomorrow, or a week hence, I cannot say now. But I do ask you to keep your knowledge to yourself until I have had an opportunity of consulting Mr. Forbes. I undertake to tell you the exact position of matters without delay, and I accept all responsibility for my present advice. I know little of the world, Mr. Thaden, said Miss Beale, rising and beginning to draw on her gloves, but I shall be very greatly surprised if you are advising me to act otherwise than honorably. I shall certainly not utter a word about Mr. Forbes at Scotland Yard. When all is said and done, my statement to you was largely guesswork. You must remember that I have never seen Mr. Forbes, nor hardly ever heard his name except in connection with public matters in the press. Oh, yes. I make that promise readily. I trust you implicitly. Chapter 6. Close Quarters. Thaden escorted Miss Beale downstairs. As they passed the closed door of number 17, the lady shivered. To think that within the next few days I would have been staying there with Edith and planning evenings at the theatre before going to Newquay, she murmured. There was a pitiful catch in her voice that told better than words how the remainder of her existence would be darkened by the tragedy. At best she was a shrinking, timid little woman, for whom life probably held but narrow interests. Such as they were, their placid content was forever shattered. The death of her niece had closed the one chief avenue leading to the outer world. She would retire to the quiet backwater of Iffley, to become more faded, more insignificant, more lonely each year. Thaden commiserated with her deeply and did not hesitate to utter his thoughts while putting her into a cab. Have you no friends in London? He inquired. I don't like the notion of sending you off alone into this wilderness. London is the worst place in the world for anyone in distress. The heedless multitude seems to be callous and unsympathetic. It isn't, in reality. It simply doesn't know, and doesn't bother. I used to claim some acquaintances here, but I have lost track of them for years, she said. In any event, I shall have more than enough to occupy my mind today. The inquest opens at 3 o'clock, and I must face the ordeal of identifying Edith's body. The detective told me that this should be done by a relation, while the only other person who could act, and Rogers, has been nearly out of her mind since yesterday morning. Where are you staying? She mentioned a small hotel in the West End. I used to go there with my people when I was a girl, she added, sadly. Then I'll get my sister to call. You'll like her. She's a jolly good sort, and a chat with another woman will be far more beneficial than the society of detectives and lawyers and such like strange fowl. Keep your spirits up, Miss Beale. Nothing that you can say or do now will restore the life so cruelly taken, but you and I, each in our own way, can strive to bring the murderer to justice. I am convinced that a distinct step in that direction will be taken this very day. You can count on seeing or hearing from me as soon as possible after I have discussed matters with Mr. Forbes. Meanwhile, don't forget to have a lawyer representing you at the inquest. They parted as though they were friends of long standing. Thaden was genuinely sorry for this gray-haired woman's plight, and she evidently regarded him as a kind-hearted and eminently trustworthy young man. He stood and watched the cab as it bore her off swiftly into the maelstrom of London. He could not help thinking that seldom had he met one less fitted for the notoriety thrust upon all connected with a much-talked-of crime. When the press interviewers, the photographers, the 101 officials with whom she must be brought in contact, were done with her, poor Miss Beale would retire to her Oxfordshire nook in a state of mental bewilderment that would baffle description. In one of his books, Thaden had endeavored to depict just such a middle-aged spinster confronted with a situation not wholly unlike that which now faced Miss Beale. He smiled grimly when he realized how far fiction had wandered from fact. The woman of his imagination had acted with a strength of character, a decisiveness, that outwitted and confounded certain scheming personages in the story. How different was the reality? Miss Beale, rushing across London in a taxi, reminded him of nothing more masterful than a cage-bird turned loose in a tempest. He was about to re-enter the mansions, meaning to telephone to both the Fortescue Square house and the old Broad Street offices, and ask for instant news of Mr. Forbes in either locality. He was so preoccupied that he failed to notice an approaching taxicab, though the driver was signaling, and even tooted a motor horn loudly in the endeavor to attract his attention. He did, however, catch his own name, and halted. "Beg pardon, sir, but you are Mr. Thaden, aren't you?" said the man. Then Thaden recognized Evans, the taxi driver, who had brought him from Fortescue Square. "Hello," he cried. "Any news of the grey car?" "Yes, sir, I think so," was the somewhat surprising answer. "When I dropped you last night, I got a fare to Euston. Then I took a gentleman to the Langham, and, as I felt like a snack, I pulled into the nearest cab rank. I was having some coffee and a sandwich when I happened to speak about the grey car to one of the chaps. 'That's odd,' he said. 'Quarter of an hour ago I had a theatre job to Langham Place, and a grey Lendolet stopped in front of the Chinese embassy. It came along from the east side, too. He didn't notice the number, sir, so there may be nothing in it, after all. But I thought you might like to hear what my pal said. Was the car empty? Did it call for someone at the embassy? That's the queer part of it, sir. I act particular. This grey car brought a gentleman, a small, youngish man, who skipped up the embassy steps like a lamplighter, and went in afore you could swine knife. Somebody might ha' been watching for him through the keyhole. The door was opened that quick. Then the car went off. My friend wouldn't ha' given a second thought to it if the gentleman hadn't vanished like a jack-in-the-box. That's why he remembered the color of the car." Thaden tried to look as though Evans's statement merely puzzled him, whereas his mind was already busy with the extraordinary coincidences which the haphazard events of a few hours had produced. Was the Far East bound up in some mysterious way with Mrs. Lester's death? Did the crime possess a political significance? If so, an explanation by Forbes was more than ever demanded. "Your informant was not mistaken about the Chinese embassy, I suppose," he said. "No, sir. He's always in that district. His garage is at the back of Great Portland Street. He knows most of them their chinks by sight." "Then that grey car can hardly have been our grey car," commented Thaden, deeming it wise to prevent the sharp-witted taxi driver from jumping at conclusions. "I'm afraid not, sir. Still, I just took the liberty. I'm very much obliged to you, of course. I said half a crown, didn't I? Here you are. Keep an eye open for XY1314 and let me know if you hear or see anything of it." "Thank you, sir." Then Evans lifted his eyes to the block of buildings. "A nasty business this murder which was done ere the other night, sir," he went on. "One, you'd hardly believe it possible for such things to take place in London nowadays." Much as he was disinclined for gossip of the sort at the moment, Thaden saw that he must endeavor to dissociate the grey car and the crime from their dangerous juxtaposition in the man's mind. So he spoke about Mrs. Lester's attractive appearance, harped on the apparent aimlessness of the deed, hinted darkly at clues in the possession of the police, and finally got rid of the well-meaning chauffeur. Back he went to his telephone, and having ascertained that Mr. Forbes was fully expected to put in an appearance at the city office before noon, settled down to read the newspapers. They contained sensational but fairly accurate accounts of the tragedy. One enterprising journal had published an interview with Bates, whom the reporter described as a typical British manservant, which was amusing, since Bates had retired non-commissioned officer written all over his square frame and soldierly features. The same journalist spoke of Thaden himself, and had even ferreted out the fact that Mrs. Lester was the widow of an English barrister who had died at Shanghai. On reaction, Thaden saw that there was nothing unusual in this statement. The connection between the metropolitan press and the bar is old and intimate, and scores of junior barristers must remember Arthur Lester's beginnings. Resolved to possess his soul in patience till 12 o'clock, the hour being yet barely 11:30 a.m., Thaden tackled a page of reviews, since there is always consolation for a writer in learning at second hand what sheer drivel others can produce. He was growling at the discovery that some hapless essayist had appropriated a title which he himself had marked down for his next book, when the doorbell rang. He did not give much heed, because so many tradesmen called during the course of each morning. So he was surprised and startled when Bates announced, "Mr. Forbes to see you, sir." Had a powerful spring concealed in the seat of his chair been released suddenly, Thaden could not have bounced to his feet with greater speed. Forbes came in. He was pale, but self-contained and clear-eyed. "Forgive an unceremonious visit," he said. "I'm glad to find you at home. I meant to arrive here sooner, but I was detained on business of some importance." By this time Bates had closed the door. Thaden explained his presence in the flat by saying that within a few minutes he would have been telephoning again to Old Broad Street. "Ah, did you speak to MacDonald?" said Forbes, dropping into a chair with a curious lassitude of manner which did not escape Thaden. "Yes. I have been most anxious to have a word with you." Forbes broke in with a short laugh. "You would get nothing out of MacDonald," he said. "He knows that my visits to the Chinese embassy are few and far between and generally have to do with. But what is it now? Why should you be so perturbed when I mention the Chinese embassy?" Thaden was literally astounded and did not strive to hide his agitation. But he was by no means tongue-tied. Now, most emphatically, was he determined to have done with pretense. Whether by accident or design, Forbes had placed himself with his back to the window. The younger man deliberately crossed the room, pulled up the blind, thus admitting the flood of light which comes only from the upper third of a window, and sat down in such a position that Forbes was compelled to turn in order to face him. "Before you utter another word, Mr. Forbes," he said gravely, "let me tell you that in my efforts to trace your whereabouts I also called up Fortescue Square." Miss Forbes came to the telephone. She said you had gone to the Home Office. By some feminine necromancy, too, she divined the link which binds you with the death of Mrs. Lester. She was distressed on your account, and I was hard put to it to extricate myself from the risk of saying something which I might regret. What do you imply by that remark?" interrupted Forbes, piercing the other with a look that was strangely reminiscent of his daughter's candid scrutiny. "I imply the serious fact that I know who visited Mrs. Lester before she met her death. I not only heard her visitor's arrival and departure, but saw him at the corner of these mansions while on my way home from Daly's Theatre, and again when he posted a letter in the pillar box on the same corner. If such unwonted interest on my part in the movements of one who was then a complete stranger surprises you, let me remind you that only a few minutes earlier I had stood by his side at the door of the theatre and heard him telling his daughter that he intended to walk to the Constitutional Club." Forbes smiled, but uttered no word. His expression was inscrutable. His pallor reminded Thaden of the tint of ivory, of that waxen-white Dutch grisaille beloved of 15th-century illuminators of manuscripts. His silence was disturbing, almost irritating, his manner singularly calm. These negative indications conveyed absolutely nothing to Thaden, who for the second time in their brief acquaintance found himself in the ridiculous position of one explaining a fault rather than, as he imagined, arraigning a man under suspicion. "So we had better dispense with ambiguities, Mr. Forbes," he went on, speaking with a precision that sounded oddly in his own ears. "It was you who called on Mrs. Lester on Monday night, you who posted the letter she wrote to Miss Beale at Iffley, Oxfordshire, you for whom the police are now searching. I have contrived thus far to keep your secret, but the situation is passing out of my control. I would help you if I could." "Why?" The monosyllable, sharp and insistent, was disconcerting as the unexpected crack of a whip, but Thaden answered valiantly. "Because of the monstrous absurdities with which fate has plagued me during the past 2 days, I appeal now for outspokenness, so I set an example. Had it not been for your daughter's remarkably attractive appearance, I should not, in all likelihood, have given a second glance at my neighbors on the steps of the theatre. But I cannot forget that I did see both her and you. Indeed, Miss Forbes herself recalled the incident, and the close questioning of the Scotland Yard men who were here last night showed me the folly of imagining that I could deny all knowledge of you. I recognize now that some impish contriving of circumstances forced this knowledge upon me. The sudden downpour of rain, and the fact that I was delayed by a slight accident to my cab, conspired with the apparently simple chance which led me to overhear the conversation between Miss Forbes and yourself. I tried hard to baffle the detectives. Again I ask why?" Thaden was rapidly being wound up to a pitch of excited resentment. "Why?" he cried. "Was I not your guest? How could I come from a house where I had been admitted to a delightful intimacy and tell the representatives of the law that my host was the man they were looking for? During some seconds, Forbes bent his eyes on the floor, seemingly in deep thought. "Thaden," he said at last, looking up in his direct way, "I am your senior by a good many years. I'm old enough, as the saying goes, to be your father. I may venture, therefore, to give you a piece of sound advice. Pack a kit bag, catch the afternoon boat train for Boulogne, and go for a walking tour in Normandy and Brittany. When I was your age and a junior in a bank, I had to take my holidays in May. Each year I tramped that corner of France. I recommend it as a playground. It will appeal to your literary instincts, and it has the immeasurable advantage just now of being practically as remote from London as the Sahara." It must not be forgotten that Thaden was a romancer, an idealist. The lounge suit of the modern tailor hampers the play of such qualities no more than the beaten armor of the age of chivalry. "If my departure for France will relieve Miss Forbes of anxiety on your behalf, I'll go," he vowed. Forbes regarded him with a new interest. "I believe you mean that," he said. "I do. But I cannot send you out of the country on a false pretense. It was your safety and well-being, not my daughter's, that I was thinking of. What have I to fear? I do not know. I am like a man wandering by night in a jungle alive with fearsome beasts and reptiles. Yet you had some reason for suggesting my prompt departure. Yes, it is an absurd thing to say, but I believe I am putting you in danger of your life by coming here this morning. Can't you speak plainly, Mr. Forbes? What good purpose do you serve by holding forth these vague terrors? If, as Miss Forbes told me, you have visited the Home Office, I take it you made yourself clear to the authorities, assuming, that is, you went there in connection with the amazing conditions which seem to be bound up with this crime. There is a certain class of knowledge which is in itself dangerous to those who possess it, no matter whether or not it affects them in any particular. I recommend you, in good faith, to leave London today. If my own safety is the only consideration, I refuse as readily as I agreed before." Thaden's tone grew somewhat impatient. He really fancied that Forbes was trifling with him. Indeed, a queer doubt of the man's complete sanity now peeped up in him. Forbes was regarded as a crank by a large section of the public on account of his peace propaganda. If that opinion were justified, why should he not be eccentric in other respects? It was fantastic, almost stupid, to look upon him as responsible for Mrs. Lester's murder. But there was always a possibility that he might be utilizing the chance which led him to her apartment shortly before the crime was committed to cover himself and his movements with a veil of spurious mystery. In a word, though Thaden had likened his visitor's face to a mask of ivory, he had momentarily forgotten the ominous token found on Mrs. Lester's body and duplicated in Forbes's own house by the morning's post. Forbes spread wide his hands with the air of one who heard, but was allowing his thoughts to wander. When next he spoke, it was only to increase the crazy inconsequence of their talk. "Later, perhaps today, perhaps it may never be necessary, I may explain myself to your heart's content," he said slowly. "At present I am here to ask a favor. In the first place, is Mrs. Lester's flat in charge of the police?" "I suppose so," said Thaden. "Is there a detective or constable on duty there now?" "I'm not sure. I imagine there is not. When the Scotland Yard men and I came out after midnight, they locked the door and took away the key. The body is at the mortuary, awaiting the opening of the inquest at 3 o'clock. "Ah, I hope that would be so. Can you ascertain for certain?" "But why?" "Because I wish to go in there. And that brings me to the favor I seek. The secretary of these flats, even the hall porter, should have a master key. Borrow it on some pretext. They will give it to you." "Really, Mr. Forbes?" gasped Thaden, voicing his surprise as a preliminary to a decided refusal. He was interrupted by the insistent clang of the telephone, that curt herald which brooks no delay in answering its demand for an audience. "Pardon me one moment," he said. "I'll just see who that is." The inquirer was Evelyn Forbes. "I've waited patiently," she began, but he stopped her instantly by saying that her father was with him. "Please ask him to come to the phone," she said. Forbes rose at once. He merely assured the girl that he was engaged in important business and would be home soon after the luncheon hour. Meanwhile, she was not to go out, and his orders must be obeyed to the letter. "Now, Thaden," he said, coming back to the sitting room, "what about that key?" The most extraordinary feature of an extraordinary case was the way in which the mere sound of Evelyn Forbes's voice stilled any qualms of conscience in Thaden's breast. He knew he was acting foolishly in conducting a blind inquiry on his own account, an inquiry which might well arouse the anger and active resentment of the police, but he offered a sop to his better judgment by consulting Bates. Then came a veritable surprise. "The fact is, sir," admitted Bates nervously, "we haven't Rogers's key in the kitchen. When she went away on Monday, she left it here, being afraid of losing it. Of course, she took it on Tuesday morning, and after going from one fit of hysterics into another, she gave it to us again." Thaden's face was eloquent of the serious view of this avowal. "Did you tell the police?" he said. "No, sir. My missus and me clean forgot all about it. So, while Mrs. Lester was being killed, the key of her flat was actually in your possession. I suppose it might be put that way, sir." By this time, Thaden was becoming exasperated at the veritable conspiracy which fate had engineered for the express purpose, apparently, of entangling him in an abominable crime. "Why on earth didn't you mention such an important fact to the detectives?" he almost shouted. "Don't you see they are bound to think?" "Oh, a plague on the detectives and on what they think," broke in Forbes imperiously. "It doesn't matter a straw what they think, and very little what they do. This affair goes a long way beyond the 4-mile radius, Thaden. The vital point is that your man has the key. Where is it? Let us go in there at once." "You offered me some advice, Mr. Forbes," said Thaden firmly. "Let me now return it in kind. If you wish to examine Mrs. Lester's flat, why not seek the permission of Scotland Yard? My good fellow, I have spent a valuable hour this morning in persuading the Home Secretary that the less Scotland Yard interferes in my behalf, the more effectually shall I be protected. I don't want any detective within a mile of my house or office. But, as I have told you already, explanations must wait. You, Bates, look a man who can hold his tongue. Do so, and with Mr. Thaden's permission I'll make it worth your while when this storm has blown over. Now, give me that key." Thaden was silenced, if not convinced. He realized, of course, that he must make a full confession to the Criminal Investigation Department before the sun went down, but argued that he might as well see the present adventure through. Soon he and Forbes were standing at the door of number 17. Forbes curbed his impatience sufficiently to permit of anyone who happened to be in the interior answering the summons of the electric bell. Of course, no one came. The police had no reason to remain in charge of the place. Annan Rogers would have become a raving lunatic if left alone there for 1/2 hour. The aromatic odor of the burnt joss stick still clung to the suite of apartments, and Forbes noticed it at once. "Where was the body found?" he asked. Thaden led the way to the bedroom. He related Winter's theory of the crime, and pointed out its seeming aimlessness. So far as the police could ascertain from the half-crazy servant, none of Mrs. Lester's jewels was missing. Even her gold purse, containing a fair sum of money, was found on the dressing table. He did not know that the detectives had taken away a few scraps of torn paper thrown carelessly into the grate and had carefully gathered up a tiny snake-like curl of white ash from the tiled hearth, which, on analysis, would probably prove to be the remains of the joss stick. Forbes gazed at the impression on the side of the bed as though the body of the woman whom he had last seen in full possession of her grace and beauty was still lying there. The vision seemed to affect him profoundly. He did not speak for fully a minute, and, when speech came, his voice was low and strained. "Tell me everything you know," he said. "The Scotland Yard men took an unusual step in admitting you to their conclave. They must have had some motive. Tell me what they said, their very words, if you can recall them." Thaden was uncomfortably aware of a strange compulsion to obey. His commonplace, everyday senses cried out in revolt, and warned him that he was tampering dangerously with matters which should be left to the cold scrutiny of the law, but some subconscious instinct overpowered these prudent monitors, and he gave an almost exact account of his talk with Winter and Furneaux. Then followed questions, eager, searching, almost uncanny in their prescience. "The little one, who strikes me as having more brains than I credit the ordinary London policeman with, spoke of the evil deities of China. How did such an extraordinary topic crop up? In connection with the joss stick? Yes, but I don't see the inference. Mr. Winter alluded to the habit some ladies have of burning such incense in their houses, whereupon Furneaux remarked that the Chinese use them to propitiate harmful spirits. Was that all?" Thaden felt insensibly that his companion was hinting at something more definite, but he was bound in honor to respect the confidence reposed in him. "I don't quite understand," he temporized. Was nothing said as to the finding of some object, such as a small article obviously Chinese in origin, which might turn an inquirer's thought into that channel. The conversation I am relating took place the moment after we had entered the flat. We were standing in the hall. It was wholly the outcome of the strange smell which was immediately perceptible. Forbes passed a hand over his eyes. "I wonder," he breathed. Then, turning quickly on Thaden, he repeats the question. "Are you quite sure they did not mention the discovery in this room of any object which could be regarded, even remotely, as a sign or symbol left by the murderer to show that his crime was an act of vengeance or retaliation?" Thaden hesitated. Unquestionably, he was in a position of no ordinary difficulty. But his doubts were solved by an interruption that brought his heart into his mouth, because a thin, high-pitched voice came through the half-open door. "Are you thinking of a small ivory skull, Mr. Forbes?" Chapter 7, wherein Mr. Forbes explains himself. Even the boldest may flinch when confronted with that which is apparently a manifestation of the supernatural. Thaden and Forbes were standing in a chamber of death. To the best of their belief, they were alone in an otherwise empty flat, and those ominous words coming from some one unknown and unseen blanched their faces with terror. But Thaden was a healthy and athletic young Englishman, and Forbes was of the rare order which combines a frame of exceptional physique with a mind accustomed to think imperially. Two such men might be trusted to display real grit if surrounded by a horde of veritable spooks. The door was thrown wide as they turned at the sound of the words, and Thaden recognized in a strange little figure, wearing a blue serge suit, a straw hat and brown boots, Furneaux, the man whom he had looked on as somewhat of a crank and visionary during their talk of the previous night. "You?" he gasped, and the note of recognition was sharpened by a sudden sense of dismay, almost of alarm, because of the overwhelming knowledge that now all his scheming had collapsed, while the representatives of Scotland Yard would regard him as nothing more than a poor sort of trickster. But Forbes was not in the habit of yielding to any man, no matter what his status, or howsoever awe-inspiring might be the Department of State which he represented. "Who the devil are you, at any rate?" he cried angrily. "And what right have you to spy on gentlemen in this manner, listening to their conversation, and breaking in with a cheap stage effect obviously intended to startle?" Furneaux remained motionless, his feet set well apart and his hands thrust into his trousers pockets. The trim, natty figure, the spruce and summer-like attire, the small, wizened face with its cynically humorous and wide-awake aspect. Above all, a certain jauntiness of air and cocksure expression certainly did not suggest a comedian fresh from the boards. "You tell," he said, nodding to Thaden. "This is Mr. Furneaux of Scotland Yard," said the latter nervously. He imagined he could detect in Furneaux's glance a mixture of amusement and contempt. Amusement at the notion that any amateur should harbor the belief that the two best men in the yard could be egregiously hoodwinked, and contempt of one who so far forgot himself as even to dare attempt such a thing in relation to a police inquiry into a murder. "I don't know, and care less, who Mr. Furneaux of Scotland Yard may be," went on Forbes hotly. "I resent his intrusion, and wish to be relieved of his presence." "Why," said Furneaux, "I have given my reasons to the Home Secretary. That mere statement must suffice for you. Really, I must ask you to be more explicit. I visited the Home Office this morning and placed such evidence in the hands of the Home Secretary that Scotland Yard will be requested to suspend all further investigation into the death of Mrs. Lester." "Do you mean that the Home Secretary has sanctioned the breaking off of this inquiry, in the conditions?" "Because, if that is what your words imply, Mr. Forbes, I may tell you at once that I don't believe you. It is more than any Home Secretary dare do, and if you harbor any lingering doubts on the point, go to Mr. Thaden's telephone, ring up the Home Office, and tell the gentleman at the other end of the wire exactly what I have said. Of course, you really don't mean anything of the sort. By virtue of some special and inside knowledge of certain facts communicated to the Home Secretary, you may have persuaded him to promise that, provided the ends of justice are not defeated thereby, every precaution will be taken to keep the main lines of the inquiry secret until the whole position can be laid before the law officers of the Crown. The Home Secretary may have gone that far, Mr. Forbes, but not 1 inch farther, and you know it. The two antagonists, so singularly disproportionate in size, were yet so perfectly matched in the vastly more important qualities of brain and nerve that the contest lost all sense of inequality. Thaden felt himself of no account in this duel. He was like an urchin watching open-mouthed a combat of gladiators. Forbes, not without a perceptible effort, choked down his wrath and recovered his poise. "You have gauged the state of affairs accurately enough," he said, speaking more calmly. "May I, then, recommend you to consult your direct superiors before carrying your investigations any further, Mr. Furneaux, Charles Francois Furneaux." "Just so, Mr. Charles Francois Furneaux. I give you my full name, because one of the peculiar features of this case is the inability of some persons mixed up in it to recall names, or even the mere salient facts." And the detective's glance dwelt for an instant on Thaden, who, again, in his own estimation, shrank into the boots of a fourth-form boy detected by a master in an overt breach of college rules. But the little man was speaking impressively, and Thaden compelled his wandering wits to pay attention. "It will clear the air, perhaps," went on Furneaux, "if I point out that if anyone here is playing the spy, carrying on some underhanded game, that is, it is not I. These apartments are in charge of the police. The manager of the whole block of flats and the porter of this particular section have been warned that no one can be allowed to enter number 17, on any pretext, until our inquiry is closed. Now, Mr. Forbes, kindly explain how you contrived to get possession of a key." An experienced man of the world like Forbes could hardly fail to see that he was in a false position, and that any persistent attempt to browbeat the detective would not only meet with utter failure but might possibly compromise him gravely. "That was a simple matter," he said. "Mrs. Lester's servant left her key in Mr. Thaden's establishment. Bates surprised both his master and me by producing it when I expressed a wish to examine the place. But why adopt such a clandestine method?" Forbes's face, usually so classic in outline, assumed a certain rigidity, and his firm chin grew markedly aggressive. "I don't answer questions put in that way," he said. Furneaux laughed sardonically. "You meet with greater respect in Capel Court, I have no doubt," he snapped. "There you stand on a pedestal, with one hand flourishing a checkbook and the other resting gracefully on the neck of a golden calf. Here, you are simply an ordinary citizen behaving in a suspicious manner. If the uniformed policeman on the neighboring beat knew what I know of your recent movements, he would arrest you without ceremony and charge you with being concerned in the murder of Mrs. Lester. Between you and Mr. Thaden, the work of my department has been hindered and burked most scandalously. Don't glare at me like that. I don't care tuppence for your millions and your social position. What I do care about is the horrible risk you and each member of your family are incurring. You know why, and while you are still alive I mean to force you to speak. Tell me now why Mrs. Lester was killed. Tell me, too, why the same hand which thrust a little ivory skull into the dead woman's underbodice caused a similar token to be delivered to you by this morning's post. Ah, that touches you, does it? Now, my worthy financier and philanthropist, step down from your pedestal and behave like a being of flesh and blood." Forbes positively wilted under that extraordinary attack. His white face grew wan, and his eyes dilated with surprise and terror. The detective's words seemed to have the effect of a paralytic shock. Thenceforth he was underdog in the fight. "How do you know," he gasped, "that I received an ivory skull this morning? Have you been to my house? Did my daughter tell you?" Furneaux chuckled. "You're ready to listen, eh? Well, I don't mind telling you that I have not stirred out of this flat since 7 o'clock this morning, and I question if your letters were delivered in Fortescue Square at that hour." "I give in," said Forbes curtly. "Need we remain here? The smell of that cursed joss stick oppresses me." Then Thaden found his tongue. "If Mr. Furneaux cares to abandon his vigil, my flat is entirely at your disposal," he said. "My vigil, as you accurately describe it, has ended for the time being," said Furneaux, apparently mollified by the millionaire's surrender. "I was sure that if I remained here long enough I would clear away some of the fog attached to a case which promises to be one of the most remarkable I have ever investigated. Come, gentlemen, let us be amiable to one another. I'm sorry if I lost my temper just now, but I regard myself as being the only detective in existence who uses other sections of his brain than those governed by statutes made and provided, and it riles me when men of superior intelligence like yourselves treat me as though my mission in life was to direct the traffic and keep a sharp eye on mischievous juveniles. Mr. Thaden, can that soldier servant of yours make coffee?" "His wife can," said Thaden. "Will you be good enough, then, to set her to work? Thus far, since the sun rose, I have stayed the pangs of hunger with an apple and a glass of water." By this time, Thaden had thoroughly revised his first estimate of the diminutive detective. Indeed, he was beginning to look on him as a quite noteworthy person, a man whose mental equipment it was most unwise to assess at any lower valuation than the somewhat exalted one which Furneaux himself had set forth with such refreshing candor. As for Forbes, the millionaire seemed to have sunk into a species of stupor since Furneaux spoke of the ivory skull. He uttered no word until the three were seated in Thaden's room, and his expression was so woebegone that it stirred even the mercurial Jerseyite to pity. "I imagine that a cup of coffee will do you also a world of good," he said. Then, whirling round on Thaden, he stuck a question into him as if each word was a stiletto. "Where do you get your coffee?" "At the grocer's," was the surprised answer. "Is that all you know about it?" "Yes." "Singular thing, isn't it?" mused the detective aloud. "How idiotic men and women can be in their attitude to the supreme things of life. What is of greater importance than the food we eat and the liquors we drink? Through them the body reconstitutes itself hourly and daily. Providence gives us a perfect engine, yet we clog and choke its shafts and cylinders by supplying it haphazard with any sort of fuel and lubricant, no matter how unsuited either may be to its purpose. Take coffee, for instance. The physiological action of coffee depends on the presence of the alkaloid caffeine, which varies from 0.6% in the Arabian berry to 2% in that of Sierra Leone. Again, the aromatic oil, caffeine, which is developed by roasting, increases in quantity the longer the seeds are kept. Unfortunately, coffee beans lose weight during storage, so you have a clear commercial reason why grocers should not sell the best coffee, unless under compulsion of an enlightened public opinion. Now you, Mr. Forbes, would never dream of putting your money into an investment without full and careful inquiry into the history and scope of the proposed undertaking, while our young friend here would snort furiously at a split infinitive or a false rhyme. Yet, when I submit the vital problem of the sort of coffee you imbibe, the very essence and nutriment of your brains and bodies, you hear the kind of answer I receive. All this, of course, was excellent fooling, intended to dispel the brooding horror which had suddenly descended upon Forbes since it was borne in on him that the demoniac wrath wreaked on Mrs. Lester was now directed with equal ferocity against his family and himself. To an extent, Furneaux's scheme succeeded. A gleam of interest shot from the millionaire's eyes. They lost their introspective look. He even smiled wistfully. "You are a man after my own heart, Mr. Furneaux," he said. "I had no idea that the Criminal Investigation Department employed philosophers of your caliber. I suppose that you and I are about to swallow coffee containing indeterminate percentages of the chief constituents you named." "One does not look at gift coffee in the cup," grinned the little man, obviously well pleased with himself. "But, if ever you two gentlemen favor my obscure dwelling with a visit, and partake of a meal, you will have a strict analysis with every bite and sup. There is a grocer in Battersea who used to tremble at sight of me. Now he has learned wisdom, and has quadrupled his trade by publishing learned disquisitions on the nature and quality of each principal article he sells. You ought to read his treatise on butter. He is an authority on the dietetic value of jam. The nutritive properties of his cheese are ruining the local butchers." Furneaux's efforts were rewarded when the really excellent beverage provided by Mrs. Bates was disposed of. Forbes seemingly atoned for his earlier secretiveness by placing every fact in his possession fully and fairly before his auditors. "Nearly 7 years ago," he said, "I made a very large sum of money by amalgamating certain shipping interests at a favorable moment. Thus, as it happened, I had at command practically unlimited resources when I was asked to finance the cause of reform in China. The wretched lot of the Chinese nation had always appealed to my sympathies. Some hundreds of millions of the most industrious and peace-loving people in the world have been exploited for centuries by a predatory caste. Given a chance to expand, freed from the shackles of the Manchus, the Chinese, in my opinion, contain the elements which go to form a great race. But the Manchus held them in bondage, body and soul. And, so powerful is self-interest, there has never been an emperor or statesman who strove to elevate the masses who was not mercilessly assassinated as soon as he allowed his intent to become known. The only path to freedom lay through revolution, and I had reason to believe that the ruling faction could be overthrown by a well-organized and properly financed movement without the appalling bloodshed which often accompanies such dynastic changes. At any rate, I entered the conspiracy, heart and soul. But I met with two difficulties at the outset. I could not exercise efficient financial control in London, and I could neither go and live in the Far East nor transact my business through ordinary banking channels. So I had to find a substitute, and my choice fell on a rising young barrister named Arthur Lester, whom I had known since he was a boy who had married the daughter of an old friend. He had a taste for adventure, and was alive to the magnificent career which lay before one who helped materially in the rebirth of China. In a word, he went to Shanghai as my agent, and the outcome of his work there is the present Chinese constitution. Of course, as holds good in all human affairs, events did not follow the precise track mapped out for them. But, on the whole, he and I were satisfied. China is awake at last. The giant has stirred, and, if his first uncertain steps have deviated from the open road of reform, he will never again sink into the torpor of the past centuries. Manchu arrogance and domination, at any rate, are shadows of the past, but unhappily, the conquerors who have been so effectually thrust aside have now embarked on a secret campaign of vengeance and reaction. A society which calls itself the Young Manchus is inspired by one principle, and one only, and that is death to the reformers. I don't suppose you gentlemen follow closely the trend of affairs in China, but you must have read of the assassinations of prominent men reported occasionally in the newspapers. Furneaux clicked his tongue so loudly that Forbes stopped speaking and looked at him, thinking, apparently, that the little detective meant to say something. He did, but it was Thaden whom he addressed. I'd give a week's pay if Winter was here now, and I could see those big eyes of his bulging out of his head, he cackled. Thaden nodded. He understood perfectly. Then he caught Forbes's inquiring glance and explained matters. Mr. Furneaux hinted last night at some such development as that which your present statement conveys, and his colleague, Mr. Winter, pretended to scout it, he said. Pretended, shrieked Furneaux, instantly in a rage. That was how it struck me, said Thaden coolly. Didn't I drag the Chinese aspect of the crime out of him with pincers? Came the indignant demand. Unquestionably. I only remarked that your large-sized friend had it tucked away all the time at the back of his head. Furneaux pounded the table so viciously that the cups rattled. Of course, he has a nose to smell joss sticks, and eyes to see an ivory skull. But didn't he say I was talking nonsense when I spoke about Shang-Ti scowling from a porcelain vase? He shrilled. Yes, for all that. I don't think he missed the least hint of your meaning. Furneaux gazed at Thaden fixedly. Sorry, he said, with an acid tone that was almost malicious. I imagined you were so busy throwing dust in our eyes that you wouldn't have noticed such fine shades of perception on Winter's part. But Thaden was now able to measure this strange little man with some degree of accuracy. He only smiled. As a thrower of dust I was a most abject failure, he said. Furneaux smiled and turned to the millionaire. Pardon the interruption, he said. Like every artist, I am pained when my best efforts are scoffed at by heedless mediocrity. You, at least, will understand what a big thing it was to deduce even the vaguest outline of the truth from the facts at my command. I certainly do, agreed Forbes. Until this morning I was convinced that Mrs. Lester's death removed the one person in England who knew of my connection with the revolution in China. To revert to the Young Manchus, they have secured far more victims than the world at large is aware of. I am sure that they poisoned Arthur Lester, and his wife held the same view. They aim at nothing less than the extinction of the democratic cause by the murder of every prominent man connected with it. But they never yet have been able to obtain a full and authentic list of the reform leaders. They suspected poor Lester of complicity in the movement and killed him. It was through Mrs. Lester that I first became aware of their existence as an active organization, and I hoped that when she had returned to England and was living quietly in London, she would be lost sight of, ignored, in fact. Nevertheless, both she and I thought it prudent that our acquaintance should cease until the turmoil in China had subsided. For that reason I never visited her, nor did I permit the growth of friendship between her and my wife and daughter, a friendship which, in happier conditions, would have been natural and inevitable. But we were woefully mistaken. An Oriental vendetta neither slackens nor dies. By some means wholly unknown to me, the Young Manchus must have discovered, or guessed, that in leaving Lester's widow out of their reckoning they had lost a promising clue. Be that as it may, they followed her to London, and, by a singular fatality, I was the first to know of it. Last Monday, while driving home from the city, my car was held up in Piccadilly for a few seconds. Looking idly out at the passing crowd, I saw a Chinaman in European clothes. He was waiting to cross the road, so I was able to scrutinize him carefully, and, owing to a scar on the left side of his face, recognized him. His name is Wong Li Fu, a Manchu of the Manchus, a mandarin of almost imperial lineage. Some years ago, he was a young attaché at the Chinese embassy here. Suddenly, while on the way to my house, I recollected that certain members of the Revolutionary Committee had spoken of this very man as being one of the ablest and most unscrupulous adherents of the Manchu faction in Pekin. Somehow, his presence in London was disconcerting and menacing. Who more likely than he, I argued, to be a leading spirit among the young Manchus? In any event, London was not big enough to hold both Mrs. Lester and him, and I decided to visit her that very night, tell her I had seen Wang Li Fu, and advise her to go away into the country, leaving no record of her whereabouts. I happened to be taking my daughter to Daly's Theatre, and contrived to slip away on some pretext after the performance. I found Mrs. Lester alone in her flat, and she fell in with my views at once, because she, too, had heard of this very man, and the mere sound of his name terrified her. I was half inclined to urge that she should go to an hotel for the night, but the lateness of the hour and the seeming fact that if danger threatened she was safe at least till the morrow, prevented me. Furneaux, sitting on the edge of a chair, his head bent forward, his piercing black eyes intent as those of a hawk, a hand resting on each knee, his attitude curiously suggestive of a readiness to spring forward at any instant, now leaned over and tapped the millionaire decisively on the shoulder. "You couldn't have saved her, Mr. Forbes," he said gravely. "She was marked down as the first warning. Didn't the letter you received this morning tell you something of the sort?" Agitation gave place to utter astonishment in Forbes's face. "In heaven's name, how do you know anything of any letter?" he cried. "I will tell you later. But am I not right?" "Yes, you are. Where is it? May I see it?" Forbes took a creased and soiled document from a small, flat cardboard box which he carried in the breast pocket of his coat. But first he withdrew from the box a little object and placed it on the table. It was an ivory skull, and the very presence of such a sinister token brought some hint of the charnel house into the cozy and sunlit room. Furneaux, a creature oddly constituted either of all nerves or of no nerves, disregarded the skull. He had eyes only for the few words typed on a single sheet of notepaper. They ran, "James Creighton Forbes, if you are willing to come to terms, announce the fact by advertisement in Thursday's Times. Address your reply to YM, and sign it JCF, yield, and you will hear further. Refuse, and no other warning will be given." Chapter 8. The First Counterstroke. Furneaux apparently made up his mind with reference to the contents of a somewhat enigmatic message after one quick, unerring perusal. "The man who wrote that took a great many things for granted," he said. "He assumed, firstly, that you knew of Mrs. Lester's death and understood its significance. Secondly, that you are aware of the nature of the terms he will offer. Thirdly, that you may hesitate between compliance and threatened death. YM, of course, can be read as young Manchus. Even there, the writer exhibits artistic reticence. Frankly, Mr. Forbes, I wish you had come straight to Scotland Yard on Monday evening instead of wasting those precious hours at Daly's Theatre." Forbes was moved to energetic protest. "How was I to deduce the true nature of these hellhounds' mission from a casual glance vouchsafed of one who may or may not be their leader?" he cried. "Yet you treated your discovery as serious enough to warrant a prompt visit to the woman with whom association was dangerous." "Yes, I wanted to act secretly." "Just so. You were afraid the police would bungle the job. Between you and Mr. Thaden, you have exhibited remarkable skill in heading us off the scent. Fortunately, we were able to dispense with your assistance, having other matters to occupy our brains. You two were ripe nuts waiting to be cracked and have the contents extracted at leisure. There were a few freshly broken shells lying about which invited immediate attention. For instance, some 4 months ago, a well-known and reputable firm of private inquiry agents was instructed from Canton to secure all possible information about Mrs. Lester and you. Yes, you, Mr. Forbes, your household, friends, methods of living, servants, tradesmen, every sort of fact, indeed, which might be useful to a thoroughgoing and well-organized society of cutthroats like the young Manchus. The inquiry agents did their work well, and were handsomely paid for it. I haven't the least doubt that Wang Li Fu knows what brand of cigars you favor and what you eat for breakfast. His informants sent us a copy of their notes an hour after the murder was announced in the newspapers. Mr. Lester is removed in Shanghai. His widow comes home. The inquiry agents receive instructions. They forward their report to Canton, and Wang Li Fu turns up in London. The program is a tribute to the excellence and regularity of the mail service between England and the Far East. While the detective was speaking, Forbes's face, already haggard, had grown desperate. I care little for my own life, he said, but I shall stop short of no measures to protect my wife and daughter. I certainly recommend that an armed guard should be on duty day and night in any house where you may happen to be living at the moment, replied Furneaux airily. I really think that if your safety alone were at stake, I would do you a good turn by arresting you on suspicion. On suspicion of what crime? Of killing Mrs. Lester, to be sure. I regard you as a clever man, Mr. Furneaux, so may I remind you that this is neither the time nor the place for a display of gross humor. Thaden expected that Furneaux would flare into anger at this well-deserved rebuke. But, much to his surprise, the detective treated the matter argumentatively. Personally, I have looked on you from the outset as an innocent man, he said placidly. But, just to show how circumstantial evidence may be twisted into plausible error, let me point out that nearly all the known facts conspire against you. Have you considered how dexterously a prosecuting counsel would treat your admission that Mrs. Lester was the one person in England who knew of your connection with the Revolutionary Party in China? And how would you set about convincing a stolid British jury that you were acting in the interests of law and order in concealing your visit to number 17 on the night of the murder? These fine-drawn speculations, however, are a sheer waste of breath. Suppose we concoct an advertisement for the Times. Do you mean that I am to parley with these ruffians? Of course you are, but the Home Secretary agreed with me that no action should be taken until the Chinese legation had considered the matter. And, pray, what can the legation do? They have their own sources of information. When all is said and done, Orientals are best fitted to deal with Orientals. Furneaux laughed sarcastically. If I remember rightly, the way in which the Chinese embassy dealt with one of your pet reformers some years ago did not win general approval. No, Mr. Forbes, we must try and circumvent the wily Chinese by other methods than torture and imprisonment. Of what avail will it be if this fellow, Wang Li Fu, is laid by the heels? Isn't it more than certain that he has plenty of determined helpers? Do you imagine that he killed Mrs. Lester? Not a bit of it. He will be able to produce the clearest proof that he was miles away from Innismore Mansions on Monday night. Now, let's see how we can get him to show his hand a little more openly. How would this be? YM. Terms can be arranged. JCF. The terms are, of course, that the whole gang be hanged or sent to penal servitude and deported. One moment, struck in Thaden. I have something to say before you decide on any definite action. I need hardly inflict on you, Mr. Furneaux, an explanation of my silence hitherto. I don't even apologize for it. Faced by a similar dilemma tomorrow, I should probably take the same line. But, to adopt your own simile, now that Mr. Forbes has come out of his shell and admits his presence here on Monday night, my self-imposed restrictions cease. In the first place, then, Miss Beale came here this morning. Excellent. I wondered who the lady was, put in Furneaux. And, secondly, the grey car which pursued me on Monday seems to have been partly identified later. A car resembling it in every detail deposited someone at the Chinese legation in Portland Place, at an hour which corresponds closely with its presence here. Ah, that is important. I like that. I wasn't far wrong when I sensed you as an absolute carrier of clue germs in this affair, cried Furneaux. The Chinese embassy, gasped Forbes. What car? And why should any car pursue you? Do you mean that you were followed on leaving my house? It was lamentable to watch the inroad which each successive shock was making on Forbes's physical resources, but Thaden affected to ignore the new fright in his eyes, and told him what had happened. Although he could see that Furneaux was in a fever of impatience to learn the later news, he thought that Forbes should know the facts in view of the remarkable statement that he had visited the Chinese embassy that morning. In one respect, the recital was a test of the millionaire's professed readiness to deal candidly with the police. Thaden was half inclined to believe that the other was still wishful to conceal that part of the day's doings. But he was mistaken. When he had finished his own story, and given the taximan's version of the grey car's appearance in Portland Place, Forbes threw out his hands in a gesture of despair. If the embassy people are playing me false, I do not know whom to trust, he said brokenly. I have just come from there, and they assure me that if Wang Li Fu and his gang are in London, they are absolutely ignorant of the fact. Pooh, cried Furneaux, snapping a thumb and forefinger. Don't worry about that. Put yourself in the position of the Chinese ambassador. He can't even guess who may be the ruler of China from one day to another. Yesterday it was an old woman, today a dictator, tomorrow the mob. Who can foretell what shape the lava erupted from a volcano will take? Bet you a new hat, Mr. Forbes, that the minute the embassy heard of Mrs. Lester's murder they put two and two together and kept a sharp eye on these mansions and on your house. That grey car is nothing more nor less than a red herring accidentally drawn across the trail. Some cute Chinaman said, "Hello. That murdered woman is the wife of Forbes's agent in Shanghai. Now, let's see what Forbes is doing and who visits him, and perhaps we'll learn something. Want to bet?" Forbes could not help but recover some of his shattered nerve in view of the detective's airy optimism. Still, he was shaken and dubious. "Don't forget that the Chinese ambassador has no knowledge whatsoever of my share in the revolution," he said. "And don't forget that for ways which are dark and tricks which are vain the heathen Kine is peculiar," retorted Furneaux. "How can you be sure that there is not in the embassy at this moment a full statement of your payments into the reformers' funds, as well as the list of conspirators which our friend Wang Lifu is in search of? I think that such a thing is almost impossible. Is there anything really impossible? We used to believe that once a man was dead he could not be brought to life again. A Frenchman has just demonstrated that by a judicious application of galvanism to the heart and salt water to the veins any average corpse can be revived." Evidently Furneaux was enjoying himself. He sat there, absorbing new impressions and irradiating scraps of irrelevant knowledge in a way that would have been full of significance to Winter had he been present. Furneaux was never so mercurial, never so ready to jump from one subject to another as when his subtle brain was working at high pressure. He actually reveled in a crime which lay on the borderland of the exotic and the grotesque. Like the French philosopher in Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination, the savant who read his newspaper in a dingy Paris room, and solved by sheer force of intellect extraordinary criminal problems which baffled the shrewdest official minds, he felt in relation to this particular tragedy that he required only to be brought in touch with certain contingent forces bound up with it, Forbes, for instance, and, in a minor degree, Thaden, and in due course he would be able to go forth and find the master wrongdoer. Suddenly the millionaire seemed to cast off the cloak of despair which clogged his energies and impaired his brilliant intellect. He rose to his feet and involuntarily squared his shoulders. "Surely we are wasting valuable hours which should be given to action," he cried. "I am going to the city and shall arrange for a prolonged absence from my office. Then I'll hurry home, perfect my defenses, and defy these murderous curs. My wife must come to London. In a crisis like this I must have my loved ones under my own personal supervision. I can still shoot straight and quick, and woe betide any man, white or yellow, who enters my house unbidden. As for this infernal symbol—" He raised a clenched fist, and would have pounded into fragments the thin fabric of the ivory skull still lying where he had placed it on the table had not Furneaux snatched it into safety. "No, no," protested the detective. "I want that for purposes of comparison. Kindly give me that typed note, too, Mr. Forbes. It may bear finger marks. You never can tell. The cardboard box in which it was posted also. Thank you. Now, a few more questions before you go. How much money did you provide for the revolutionaries?" 2 million sterling. As a gift or a loan? If they failed, I lost every farthing, of course. If they succeeded, I was to recoup myself by financing the new government. But I gather that they have neither failed nor succeeded. China has a constitution, but the presidential election was conducted on lines suspiciously akin to those recently adopted in Mexico. Nevertheless, negotiations are now on foot for a big loan. If you died, what would become of the 2 millions? They would be lost irretrievably. Furneaux sat back in his chair. "That gives one furiously to think," he said. "The grey car comes back into the picture." "What do you mean?" "I don't know. But I'll tell you what. The man who first spoke of a Chinese puzzle as a metaphor for something downright bewildering knew what he was talking about." Forbes put a hand to his forehead in an unconscious gesture of hopelessness. "My brain is reeling," he muttered. "To think that in the London of today we should live in abject terror of a band of Mongolian ruffians. Why do you remain here, man? You vaunt the prowess of your department. Why are you not scouring every haunt of Chinamen in the East End? Spread your net widely enough, and you will surely get hold of some minor scoundrel who will talk for fear or money. Bribe him to the point where he cannot refuse to speak. Wang Lifu is the only man I fear. Put him where he can accomplish no mischief, and the rest of his crew will be powerless. When you come to count up the achievements of my friend Winter and myself, in the face of stupid but nonetheless disheartening obstacles, we have not done so badly in 2 days, said Furneaux complacently. Can I drive you anywhere? My car is waiting. No, thanks. The truth is, Mr. Forbes, I look on you as a disturbing influence. A man who can talk as calmly as you about dropping $2 million on a crazy project to introduce Western methods into China is not fitted for the phlegmatic and judicial atmosphere of Scotland Yard. If I want any money, I'll come to you. If not, and all goes well at number 11 Fortescue Square, the next time I'll trouble you will be when you are asked to identify Wong Li Fu, dead or alive. Forbes seemed hardly to be aware of Furneaux's words. He went out. Thaden accompanied him, and, as they descended the stairs together, the older man said brokenly, "It is my wife and daughter for whom I fear. I can hardly control my senses when I think of these yellow fiends contemplating vengeance on me through them." Thaden, do you believe in that detective? He is either a vain fool or a genius. By the way, I forgot to ask him how he found out that I had received the warning delivered by this morning's post. I'll try and worm an explanation out of him. If he tells me, I'll telephone you later. He is an extraordinary creature, but abnormally clever at his work, I am sure. For my own part, I feel disposed to trust him implicitly. I wish you had met his colleague, Chief Inspector Winter. He is the sort of man whose mere presence inspires confidence. Forbes halted on the step of the automobile and glanced at his watch. I shall be home in an hour, he said. After that I shall not stir out all day. Telephone me if you have any news. Why not dine with us tonight? Thaden's eyes sparkled. He was longing to meet Evelyn Forbes once more, but a wretched doubt diminished the glow of gratification which the prospect brought. Should he, or should he not, tell the girl's father of the rather indiscreet admissions she had made during their brief talk that morning? That minor worry, however, was banished suddenly and forever. Furneaux, taking the 3 steps which led from entrance hall to pavement with a flying leap, cannoned right into Forbes, whom he grasped with both hands, quite as much by way of emphasis as to check the impetus of his diminutive body. In with you, he piped. Tell your chauffeur to obey my orders, no matter what they are. Action, determination, were as the breath of the millionaire's nostrils. He aroused himself instantly. You hear, Downs, he said to the chauffeur. Downs was one of those strange beings who have been evolved by the age of petrol, an automaton compounded, seemingly, of steel springs and leather. He had long ago lost the art of speech, having cultivated delicacy of hearing and quickness of sight at the expense of all other human faculties. The old-time coachman possessed a certain fluent jargon, which enabled him to chide or encourage his horses and exchange suitable comments with the drivers of brewers' drays and market carts, but the modern chauffeur is all an ear for the rhythm of machinery, all an eye for the nice calculation of the hazards of the road 50 yards ahead. At any rate, Downs mumbled something which resembled, "Yes, sir." Forbes sprang in and slammed the door. Furneaux raced round the front of the car and perched himself beside Downs, and the heavy automobile was almost into its normal stride before it had traveled twice its own length. Thaden was left gaping on the pavement. He saw that the car turned west, and caught a glimpse of Furneaux's outstretched hand with forefinger pointing like the barrel of a pistol. "Fool!" he cried, in bitter self-apostrophe. "Why didn't I jump in after Forbes? Now I'm out of the hunt. I wonder what the deuce Furneaux saw or heard." That concluding thought sent him back to the flat, 2 steps at a time. "Bates," he shouted, "has Mr. Furneaux used the telephone, or did anyone ring up?" "No, sir," said Bates, coming hurriedly at that urgent call. "First thing I knew was he was tearing out and running downstairs like mad." "Oh, double-distilled idiot that I am," growled Thaden again. "Why didn't I go with them?" As though the gods heard his plaint and meant to crush him with their answer, the telephone bell sounded at his elbow. Mechanically, he lifted the receiver off its hook and immediately became aware of Tomlinson's voice, with some element of flurry and distress in its unctuous accents. "That you, Mr. Thaden?" said the butler. "Yes. Have you had any news of Mr. Forbes, sir?" "Yes. He has just left me." "Ah, if only I had known, and had given you a call before ringing up the city. What is it? Can I do anything?" "It's Miss Evelyn, sir." "Yes? What of her?" "She's gone, sir." Thaden's heart apparently stopped for a second, and then raced madly into tumultuous action again. Gone! Good Lord, man, what do you mean? He almost groaned. A telegram came from Mrs. Forbes, at Eastbourne, saying she was ill and wanted Miss Evelyn. I tried all I knew to persuade Miss Evelyn to wait until she had spoken to her father, but she wouldn't listen. She just threw on a hat and a wrap and took a taxi to Victoria. Some membrane or film of tissue which might have served hitherto to shut off from Frank Thaden's cheery temperament any real knowledge of the pitfalls which may beset the path of the unwary seemed in that instant to shrivel as though it had been devoured by flame. He knew, how or why he could never tell, that the girl had been drawn into the plot which had already claimed so many victims and sought so many more. All doubt vanished. He spoke and acted with the swift certainty of a man tackling an emergency for which he had prepared during a long period of training and expectation. Mr. Forbes may arrive at any moment, Tomlinson, he said. Tell his office people to let you know if he goes first to the city. When you hear from or see him, say that I have either accompanied or followed Miss Evelyn to Eastbourne. If I do not catch the same train, I shall take prompt measures in other respects. Got that? Yes, sir. It was easy to distinguish the relief in Tomlinson's utterance, relief mingled, doubtless, with astonishment that a comparative stranger should display such an authoritative and prompt interest in the family affairs. That is all. Write down my message, lest you omit any part of it. Thaden rang off. Come, he said to Bates, who had not retired to his den, but was listening, discreet yet rabbit-eared, to these queer proceedings. Followed by the manservant, he darted into the sitting-room and did several things at once. He unlocked a drawer and took from it a considerable sum of money which he kept there for emergency journeys, also pocketing an automatic pistol. Pouncing on an ABC timetable, he looked up the trains for Eastbourne. A fast train left Victoria at 1:25 p.m. The hour was now 1:05. Meanwhile he was talking. Bates, he said, I promised Miss Beale, the lady who came here this morning, that my sister, Mrs. Paxton, would visit her this evening, say about 6. Miss Beale is staying at Smith's Hotel, Jermyn Street. Go to Mrs. Paxton, and see her, waiting at her house if she happens to be out. Tell everything you know about Mrs. Lester's death, and ask her to take care of Miss Beale this evening. She will understand. I'll wire her at Smith's Hotel before the dinner hour, if possible. If anybody calls here, I leave it to your discretion and your wife's whether or not they should be informed of my movements. Mr. Forbes or the police, of course, must be told everything. Miss Forbes is probably in the 1:25 p.m. train for Eastbourne, and I am going with her. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I'll wire or phone you later. Grabbing a straw hat and a bundle of telegraph forms, Thaden vanished, not even waiting to slam the outer door. Bates, who had seen service, knew that men in time of stress and danger acted just like the detective and his own employer. By jingo, he muttered, beginning to assemble the empty coffee cups on a tray. Things is waking up here, and no mistake. Thaden was fortunate in finding a taxicab depositing a fare at a neighboring block. Just before he reached the vehicle, a gentleman hurried out of the building and forestalled him. Thaden dashed up and caught the other man by the arm. My need is urgent, he said. Let me have this cab. The stranger smiled good-humoredly. He was an American and had not the least objection to being hustled by a Britisher. Indeed, he rather appreciated this exhibition of haste as a novel experience. I'm on a hair-trigger myself, he said, pleasantly. I want to make Victoria pretty quick. Can I give you a lift? In with you, cried Thaden. Now, cabby, half a sovereign if you get us to Victoria, Brighton line, in 15 minutes. I'll pay all fines. Then they were off, and the transatlantic cousins were banged against one another as the cab whirled round in a sharp semicircle. Say, cried the American, this reminds one of home. I've been here a week, and had a kind of notion that London air was half fog, half dope. But you're awake all right. Bet you a 5-spot you after a girl. I pay, said Thaden, his eyes glistening. And such a girl. Her portrait on the paper wrap of a 50-cent novel would sell it in millions. Gee whiz. Is it like that? Go right ahead, Augustus. Never mind me. Take this old bus all the way to Paris. I'll find the fares and hold your hat. But kindly shift that gun into your opposite pocket. You've dug it into my thigh quite often enough. If you want to get first drop on the other fellow, shove it up your sleeve.